Jack was swimming deep underwater, wondering why he had such a pounding headache when suddenly he had a terrifying realization. He had no idea where he was or what he was doing. There was a nagging feeling that he must have a specific reason to be here. You don't just end up deep in the ocean with a diving suit on by chance. Yet he had no idea what he was supposed to be doing. He wasn't sure he cared either. He was more worried about the throbbing pain in his head and the vision of two eyes staring at him out of the dark that he couldn't get out of his mind. His heart began to race as he wondered what to do and how to get help. He was in the middle of the ocean and appeared to be all alone. He couldn't see anything in the dark water except for this weird gray substance in front of him. Maybe he was going to die here alone. Without knowing if anyone could even hear him, he began to speak aloud about how he was consumed by sickness and that darkness was all around him. This is the story of one of the most powerful and dangerous anomalies yet discovered, SCP-3000. Before Jack's descent into despair, the SCP Foundation had mandated an exploratory expedition off the coast of Bangladesh. After receiving a few strange reports from locals and fishermen, the Foundation suspected an SCP was lurking in the water and positioned a few personnel to investigate. The crew expected danger, or maybe even death. But what they got instead was far stranger and more ominous. All of the men had been verified to be in sound mental states when the mission set out, but a few of them reported feeling strange and uneasy as the submarine descended into the ocean. Before long, a veteran agent named Dr. Williams began to panic in a way that was completely out of character. He started sweating profusely, shaking, and wouldn't listen to a word of comfort or reason that anybody tried to offer. It might seem like a relatively normal reaction for anyone descending into the depths of the ocean to meet with a monster that they don't know anything about, but Dr. Williams was a seasoned professional who had been on hundreds of such missions before. There was no logical reason for him to act like this. Although the reaction of Dr. Williams was the most extreme, he wasn't the only one who started to feel strange. Multiple agents developed a creeping feeling of unease that swept over them. One of the calmer men tried to reason with Dr. Williams, asking him what was wrong and if he could explain exactly how he was feeling. That's when things got even stranger. Not only was the doctor extremely anxious, but he now seemed incapable of giving a real response to any questions thrown at him. He could only mutter that he was missing something, but he wasn't sure what. Knowing that many SCPs can bend reality and the human mind, many of the personnel began to have second thoughts about the mission and even asked for permission to call off the mission, but they were mandated to continue, so they went on. As the team went deeper and deeper into the ocean, things only got worse. Even the previously calm crew members became spooked and antsy, while the ones who were already anxious were now sweating and jittering. As for Dr. Williams, he was now pacing back and forth around the submarine, saying things nobody could understand. Every time he looked at his colleagues and his close friends, he seemed to stare straight through them and would call them by the wrong names. It was as if his mind had moved to a different dimension. Whenever someone asked him to perform his normal duties, he looked more confused than ever. Still, the team went deeper. Dr. Williams began to whimper and say the word "no" repeatedly, growing louder and louder until he was screaming, and the others were forced to sedate him. Just then, something came into view. It was what would come to be known as SCP-3000. The thing was huge, so huge that its whole body couldn't be seen out of the submarine window. It was a horrible eel-looking creature with a head as big as a town and haunting eyes that lit up the black ocean around it. But perhaps the strangest part was this giant eel seemed to be producing a weird gray liquid. Even the sedative wasn't enough to keep Dr. Williams calm anymore. There was a strange blank look in his eyes as if the light and life had left him, and he just began screaming "no" repeatedly again and wouldn't respond to any attempts to calm him down. Not that anyone else was very capable of calming him down at this point. Even the crew members that had been holding up well were starting to act strangely, and nobody could get the image of these ominous eyes out of their heads. Then things went from bad to worse. Williams began screaming and shouting madly as if he was being tortured by an unseen force. The men tried to restrain him, but it was no use. He began smashing his head against the submarine window until it cracked, putting the whole mission and everyone's life at risk. He fell to the ground injured, chanting that there was nothing, whatever that meant. It was an emergency scenario. They began applying first aid to Williams as the submarine ascended to the surface as quickly as possible before the pressure of the ocean caused the cracked window to explode. By the time they reached the surface, Williams was dead. But there was something even more chilling than the circumstances of his death. Every single man who had been in that submarine experienced the same thing on the days that came afterward. The image of the eel-like creature's eyes seemed burned in their minds permanently. It would haunt their waking hours for the rest of their lives, and sleep was no escape either, as they would appear in both their dreams and nightmares alike forever. A second mission had to be sent to gather more information about the strange beast. Already, there were many theories and question marks surrounding SCP-3000. How big was it really? Was it sentient? What was the liquid for? None of the men who had been on the previous mission were willing to return to the waters, but a new group of brave recruits volunteered. They were about to find out what so many in history have learned the hard way, that bravery and foolishness are often mistaken for the same thing. This time, the mission would not be in a submarine, but in dive suits, in order to observe the anomaly in even closer detail, and to eliminate the chance of one team member self-sabotaging the submarine, killing them all. They were transported to the location by boat, and the 3 men splashed into the ocean. They descended, and at first everything was going well. In case anything went wrong, the 3 of them were tethered together for extra security. But the deeper into the ocean they swam, and the closer they got to SCP-3000's location they got, the stranger things became, just like on the last mission. First, there were a few minor cases of confusion. One of the team, Jack, thought it was his responsibility to lead the navigation, but another, Roberto, also thought it was his job. In fact, navigation was actually the job of a third team member, Amir, but he seemed to have forgotten. Everyone was getting confused. The team listening in on the conversations at the Foundation headquarters grew increasingly concerned about what they could hear. Was everyone losing their minds? Hopefully, nobody was about to pull another Dr. Williams on them. Still, the project leads couldn't afford to tell the men to come back to the surface. The Foundation badly needed any information they could get on this SCP, whatever the cost, so they told the men to press on. Things only got worse. Roberto was asking to speak to a colleague who passed away 2 years ago, while the others began to mutter indistinguishable phrases about eyes and darkness, not too dissimilar to the ramblings of Dr. Williams. It increasingly began to look like a suicide mission. Then, there was silence. What was going on? Each of the men had completely lost it, to the point that they cut the tether that was holding them together. All alone, Jack couldn't remember where he was or why he was here. He desperately looked around to try and gauge his surroundings, but he could only see darkness. All he could think about was a pair of large eyes and an overwhelming fear of despair and anxiety, and this weird gray fluid that was now floating in front of him. The Foundation listened as Jack started reciting a creepy speech about being on the edge of nothing, inches from oblivion, with a sickness in his mind and nothing but a pair of eyes in front of him. They listened in horror as they heard movement through the radio. It sounded like a huge creature was swimming toward the men. It had to be SCP-3000, but all 3 men were too confused to do anything about the situation or to even see what was in front of them, claiming they couldn't see anything in the darkness. There was silence for half a minute, with the team listening in, fearing the worst. Then they heard some more unintelligible mutterings. The men must be alive, but what on earth was going on? Then the gibberish started again. 2 of the men were screaming that Jack had just been swallowed whole and that they were being sucked in too. Why couldn't they just swim away? It was chaos. But then a few moments later, Roberto spoke into the radio, saying he was floating alone in the middle of the ocean and had now moved away from the eyes of SCP-3000. He finally seemed capable of forming coherent thoughts and speech. After what had just happened, Roberto now had a theory. He thought that somehow it was impossible to think straight around SCP-3000. When he'd been close enough to see the eyes, Roberto had felt a throbbing pain in his brain and been unable to think about anything. Perhaps it was something to do with that mysterious gray liquid. Even more slime was coming out of SCP-3000 now, and Roberto was determined to get a sample despite the warnings from HQ. In one final burst of motivation, he swam close enough to take some of the gray liquid and put it in a special sample collection unit that was designed to float to the surface for collection later. He had acquired some very important data, but he seemed to have lost all hope of preserving his life. Roberto started telling the team over the radio that he was dying and that his heart rate was too high, but cautioned that it would be too dangerous for anyone to try and rescue him. The personnel continued to try and communicate with Roberto to figure out what was going on, but his words had stopped making any sense until finally he went quiet. Minutes turned into hours, hours into days, and still there was no sign of Roberto or the rest of the divers. After 3 days, his radio, which had only been sending a steady stream of static, finally stopped working altogether and he was presumed dead. However, the sample Roberto had collected had survived and made it to the hands of the Foundation researchers. It turned out to be a viscous substance now known as Y909, a chemical compound and extremely strong anesthesia. Y909 causes head pain, paranoia, fear, panic, memory loss, and confusion. explaining what happened to Dr. Williams and the diving trio. The collection of Y-909 might have resulted in 2 disastrous missions, but there's a silver lining as the substance ended up becoming an invaluable tool for the SCP Foundation. Its ability to make people forget what had just happened to them can be used to eliminate knowledge of threatening SCPs among the public. It also helps the Foundation staff cope with the traumatic experiences they encounter on their missions. Although other amnestics can be used for the same purpose, none are as powerful as the one produced by SCP-3000. Before its discovery, the amnestics used would break down too quickly, not fare well in storage, or cause undesirable side effects. The only problem is the method of sourcing. The only way to obtain Y-909 is somewhat ethically questionable for most people. SCP-3000 produces Y-909 after eating, so the best way to stock up on it is by feeding the creature. Sedated D-Class personnel from the Foundation are sent on missions supposedly to observe the anomaly up close, unaware that this mission is one way only. Other divers are then sent later to collect the fluid from a safe distance and store it. Of course, it's all for the greater good of humanity. Now, the Foundation protects SCP-3000 as best as it can guard something hundreds of kilometers long. The area is carefully patrolled, and members of the public are not allowed to enter the part of the bay where it resides. Anybody who accidentally comes into contact is contained. Eventually, another pair of Foundation doctors went down in a submarine to try and learn more about SCP-3000. One became so affected by Y-909 that he began hallucinating. He started talking about Anantashesha, the king of serpents in Hinduism. Anantashesha is believed to be all that will be left after the end of the world because it exists throughout all of time simultaneously. The doctor said he believed that this was in fact Anantashesha, that SCP-3000 simply shows us that eventually everyone dies and fades into the darkness of oblivion, right before he exited the submarine and swam right into his mouth. Luckily for now, SCP-3000 seems to be in a sort of hibernation state. It rarely moves and it doesn't hunt, although it will eat when fed. But no one knows when or if it'll wake, or what it's capable of if it does. Will it destroy the world, or simply drive us all insane? It's 3 a.m. and the facility is quiet. Office workers and administrators roam the halls. Security officers stand at their posts, clad in advanced tactical armor and carrying standard-issue M4 carbines. 3 Foundation employees sit at flickering monitors watching a live feed of footage from the containment cell of the infamous SCP-106, or as it's referred to by all staff, the Old Man. No Foundation personnel are permitted to travel within 60 feet of the cell for security reasons, and nobody is permitted to physically interact with the anomaly without the approval of 2/3 of O5 Command. The observer's eyes itch and sting from hours of unending blue light exposure, but they can't look away. The Old Man is crafty. He might have the insatiable bloodlust of a hungry great white shark, but he's not mindless. He's a calculating predator, more sadistic than the worst human serial killer, and he's always searching for the next opportunity. According to the Foundation records, he's been active since at least World War II, and it's estimated that he has hundreds if not thousands of victims to his name, and many of those made simple but extremely foolish mistakes of underestimating him. After all, it only takes a few seconds of inattentiveness and the briefest moment of distraction to give him the window he needs. To do what, you ask? Oh, don't worry, you'll find out, just like they did. The Old Man has his nickname for a reason. Most of the time, he really does look exactly like that, an old man, or more specifically an old man's decaying corpse, his body covered in rotten, dark, grayish-black flesh that looks like putrid meat. Though the creature has been observed being able to change shape, the rot seems to run too deep for the Old Man to ever hide it. Foundation employees that have observed SCP-106 for extended periods of time have reported seeing it assume the form of grinning, decayed children and women whose rotted flesh barely hangs on their creaking bones. Just seeing the images through a video feed is enough to cause a lifetime of insomnia and other sleeping issues. Still, they have a job to do and the cameras remain fixed on the Old Man. He's been completely motionless for 3 months, just sitting there like a Buddhist monk in deep meditation. A novice might see this period of inactivity as a cause for celebration, but those with experience know that this is merely the calm before the storm. SCP-106 can remain in a dormant state for months at a time. Described by the Foundation scientists as a lulling state, it's believed that the Old Man is simply waiting for its captors to get soft, make a mistake, or simply have a momentary lapse in concentration, which is all it needs to make its move. It had happened so many times before, and it was about to happen again. One of the observers must have felt an overwhelming wave of anxiety as he saw the creature ever so slightly twitch. just a tiny quiver in the shoulder muscles, but that was enough to tell the observer that their day had just taken a terrifying turn. He grabbed the emergency phone fixed to his desk and practically screamed into the receiver that 106 is moving, that they need a tactical team stat. But it was already too late. He and the other two observers stared into the monitors with their mouths agape as a gooey, rust-like substance began to pool around the creature on the floor of its cell. Slowly, the creature craned its withered neck around. Its face was fixed into a broad, yellow-toothed, lipless grin. Its eyes had the kind of dull, flat malice of an underwater predator. It looked directly into the camera, directly at them, and smiled. The observers knew this was bad. Really, really bad. With what they could have sworn was a little nod, the old man began sinking into the rusty puddle it made on the ground beneath it, until it had disappeared entirely. SCP-106 is capable of phasing through any solid surface with ease, making it one of the hardest entities to reliably contain, and earning it a spot on the dreaded Keter class, reserved for the anomalies that are complete nightmares to keep locked up. Through the years of costly research and deadly trial and error, the Foundation would later devise ways of at least slowing the creature down. It's shown to have an aversion to lead, highly complex or random physical structures, and intense bright light. None of these cause harm to the creature, as far as we know, literally nothing can, but they'll at least buy you some precious extra seconds with which to at least try and escape. Seconds the three observers didn't have. One of them grabbed an emergency line again and barked into it that they had lost visual on the anomaly. Just then, the observers heard a faint, crackling sound behind them and the hissing of a chemical burn. They turned in horror to see a huge rusty burn mark expanding across the wall, right next to the door, which was their only escape route. They backed as far away from the door as they could as a rotten hand began reaching out of the mass of corrosive black sludge, followed by the grinning face of SCP-106, ready to have some fun. Meanwhile, two heavily armed security officers, Agents Goodwin and Resnick, came charging down the corridor toward the observation rooms. It became a bleak slogan during SCP-106 escape attempts that all you need to do is follow the screams, and that motto was proven true that night, because awful things were happening to the observation personnel. They were certainly screaming about it. Of course, even with the top-of-the-line firearms, there was little they could do to harm the rampaging old man. He seemed immune to all forms of physical damage. All they could hope to do was keep the thing distracted until the scientists and containment specialists finished the preparations to lure him back into his containment cell. Goodwin surged forward while Resnick covered his six. Vigilance was key, as unlike a standard human combatant, SCP-106 could attack from literally any angle, including above or below. Physical obstacles were irrelevant to him, and no cover was safe. The hardened security officers could see the burn mark on the wall of the observation room as they approached. SCP-106 was perpetually coated in a thick black mucus with powerful corrosive properties that left any surfaces it touched permanently marred. Foundation scientists speculated that this mucus served as a kind of pre-digestive substance that tenderizes meat and bone alike, but to what purpose this serves is a mystery, as the old man has never been observed eating. It's postulated that the only purpose is causing additional pain. Goodwin and Resnick knew to treat this hissing sludge as a potential threat, as the corrosive properties would remain active for as much as 6 hours before finally fizzling out. The two officers shared a quiet nod before Goodwin breached the observation room door with a hard kick. The two of them surged inside, guns at the ready. In their time working at the Foundation, they'd seen some truly horrific sights. From the mutilation of D-Class personnel, typically death row prison inmates brought in for use as SCP guinea pigs, to the violence and mayhem of a containment breach. But there was nothing in their past that would ever make the horrifying sight they saw in the observation room that night feel normal. All three observers were dead. Almost nothing remained of two of them, and the third, while still intact, no longer looked human. He looked like he'd somehow been dead 100 years in the brief period that the old man had been free. His skin was gray and completely dried out, and his mouth was locked into a perpetual scream. It was a massacre, but there was no sign of the old man. Goodwin grabbed his radio and whispered, "This is Goodwin in Observation Room 6, requesting immediate backup. We have no idea where this thing," but his sentence was cut off by a sudden scream from Agent Resnick. SCP Foundation security officers are as tough as nails, the best of the best, you might say, recruited from the top military organizations in the world. So hearing one of them scream in fright is a rare, if not impossible, occurrence. But even they were forced to yell out in fear when they looked up to see the old man standing on the ceiling, grinning down at them. Resnick raised his M4 and shot a 3-round burst at center mass. SCP-106 didn't care. Even under sustained gunfire from the 2 security officers, it didn't flinch. The old man simply reached down and snatched Agent Resnick from the ground like it was picking an apple from a tree. The old man held Resnick in one hand and pounded its other rotten fist into the agent's body, breaking all of his bones. Resnick screamed for his partner to help him, but there was no time. Before Goodwin could do anything, SCP-106 began receding back into another slimy burn mark on the wall. Only this time, he was taking his screaming victim with him. Agent Resnick gave one more horrified scream before he was pulled backward into the inky darkness, leaving the room silent except for the burning hiss of the corrosive goo left behind. You might think this would be the end of it, but no. For poor Agent Resnick, the worst was yet to come. He was being dragged into what the SCP Foundation scientists refer to as the Old Man's Pocket Dimension, a miniature layer of reality within our own where the malicious SCP is essentially a cruel, all-powerful god. According to witness reports extracted from victims who were taken to this little nightmare realm, the dimension resembles a series of twisting, endless corridors where the old man stalks and tortures his captured victims to the breaking point, manipulating space and time to his own sadistic ends. On rare occasions, the SCP will even release its victims just for the joy of hunting, capturing, and torturing them all over again. While Agent Resnick was learning the true meaning of terror, containment specialists were mobilizing in its cell, preparing the one known tried and true method of luring the old man back, tempting it with the prospect of causing even more suffering. In order to do this, Foundation personnel take one of the aforementioned Class D personnel and begin inducing extreme pain by breaking a major bone or slicing a tendon every 20 minutes. The victim's agonizing screams are then played over the facility's intercom, acting as bait for the pain-loving old man. The screams echo through the facility's otherwise silent halls as the mutilated corpse of Agent Resnick falls from a new scorch mark on the ceiling. The old man can hear the sounds of suffering ringing out through the air around him, and he can barely contain his excitement over the prospect of a new plaything. The snapped femurs, the torn Achilles tendons, it was all too good to miss. Having had its twisted fun with the security officers and observers, SCP-106 wandered back to its containment cell, where a new screaming victim awaited. The other security officers, containment specialists, and scientists evacuated the area, leaving the old man alone with his prey. While the unfortunate Class D was left to his fate, the rest of the staff commenced cleanup procedures, which mainly involved wiping the brown and black mucus from the walls. It would probably be at least another month before anything like this happened again, and new personnel would be transferred over to the facility to replace the fallen. All in all, just another night at the SCP Foundation.
Flying in a plane nowadays is about as safe as catching a ride on a bus or commuting on the subway. Of course, that doesn't stop people being afraid of flying. To some, the prospect of long-haul flights or feeling the shudder of turbulence are reasons to avoid planes altogether. And then, every year, there are stories of downed flights or those that go missing, all adding fuel to that aviophobia fire. Take, for example, the infamous Bermuda Triangle, that well-known region of the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean. What does that have to do with the fear of flying? Well, famously, a high number of aircraft are believed to have mysteriously vanished while flying over the Bermuda Triangle. Their wreckage and passengers rarely ever recovered. Stories like that are enough to make anyone think twice about setting foot in a plane again. And then, there's SCP-787. As you may have already guessed, SCP-787 is a plane. Specifically, it is a Boeing 747-200, with a wingspan of nearly 200 feet and capable of seating over 800 passengers. The 747-200 is a part of the famous Boeing 747 family of aircraft. These are quad-engine commercial airliners, designed to be the safest ever built. The particular Boeing 747-200, that has since become known by the Foundation as SCP-787, is slightly different from one that might take you from your nearest airport to your long-awaited vacation, though. For one, SCP-787 has no known date of manufacture and no call sign, both which a standard Boeing aircraft would be expected to have. Additionally, the plane's entire exterior has been repainted. Strangely, even the windows have been painted over, and the paint was still wet when SCP-787 was first discovered. As for the inner workings, all of SCP-787's mechanical components, including its turbines, engines, and landing gear, are in perfect working order with no signs of any damage. In fact, the SCP Foundation's researchers aren't even sure that SCP-787 has actually flown since its construction. The plane's machinery looks so pristine that they might be brand new, with no detectable signs of any previous use. However, inside the main body of the plane, it seems to be a different story. Anything not mechanical, like the carpets and seats, have decayed over time. Perhaps strangest of all is the cockpit. Both the pilot's and co-pilot's chairs have been replaced with two masses of computer components, arranged to take the shape of two chairs. So what, you might be thinking? After all, SCP-787 is, for all intents and purposes, just an ordinary plane. Not enough to put you off flying, right? Nothing more than a Boeing with a few little things off about it, like some missing seats and decaying upholstery. Well, there's that. And then there's the over 500 dead bodies on board. In June 1987, this flight of the dead was discovered several kilometers outside of the city of Bremerton in Washington state. The SCP Foundation moved in, securing the plane and swiftly getting it into containment. Now kept within a Foundation hangar, the interior of SCP-787 is monitored for 24 hours a day. Surveillance cameras and microphones are located within the cockpit, passenger areas, and even the plane's baggage hold, with recorded footage and sound relayed back to the Foundation. The idea of a plane filled with cadavers is certainly unnerving, and more than a little creepy. But why the need for all the surveillance? After all, the bodies on board are all dead, right? Surely they're not going anywhere. Well, let's talk about those bodies. How would you expect someone to die when they are aboard a plane? Maybe they'd be thrown around during a crash landing. Or perhaps a sudden depressurization might cause the passengers to suffocate due to lack of oxygen. Under normal circumstances, you might be right, but SCP-787 is no ordinary plane, and the passengers on board were not killed in ways you might expect from any ordinary aircraft accident. Referred to by research staff as SCP-787A specimens, the cadavers aboard this particular Boeing 747-200 all have dramatically different causes of death. Some of the specimens show signs of strangulation, others seem to have starved or drowned. Other bodies on board have injuries like gunshot or stab wounds, while further corpses look to have died as a result of blunt force trauma. A few have even been exsanguinated, that is, completely drained of all of their blood. One commonality among all the specimens on board SCP-787 is that some form of mutilation has occurred. 23 passengers had their tongues removed, a further 73 were scalped, 230 had Cyrillic letters carved into their left hands, and almost 500 of the passengers had their fingertips removed. Let's recap what we have so far. First, there's the Boeing 747-200 found randomly sitting in a field. Second, it's filled with over 500 mutilated bodies. And third, each one appears to have died from a cause you wouldn't typically expect from an airline accident. Seems strange enough. But of course, then there's the apparitions and noises that manifest inside SCP-787, which is why the Foundation keeps the plane under round-the-clock surveillance so they can monitor any anomalous activity taking place aboard this flight of the dead. Any attempts by Foundation personnel to enter the plane during an anomalous occurrence have led to individuals being physically ejected from SCP-787, causing severe organ damage and internal bleeding for up to 72 hours. The anomalies that occur inside SCP-787 range from the presence of loud noises with no obvious source, to the manifestation of strange human-shaped entities within the plane. The first anomalous occurrence recorded within SCP-787 was in 1988, when the sound of a loud pounding was heard against the doors and windows of the plane's left side. 2 years later, a male voice could be heard from the onboard bathroom, repeating a singular phrase over and over. Philosophers always run from the advanced thickening treatment. In 1993, the plane's in-flight entertainment system seemed to be activated by itself. The overhead screen showed a bizarre choice of in-flight movie. Colorless pictures of a deceased man, accompanied by a female voice reading a gynecology book in Czech. The same year, the longest-lasting of the SCP-787 anomalies took place. This time, the plane's fasten seatbelt sign spent almost 4 hours flickering, while the first 15 seconds of Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit played on a loop over the onboard speakers. It wasn't until 1997 that the first of the humanoid entities appeared aboard SCP-787. This figure was indistinct, lacking any discernible detail, little more than just a human shape standing in the aisles. Observed by the Foundation's surveillance equipment, the figure was seen removing an emergency oxygen supply and mask from seat H43. It stood perfectly still, wearing the passenger's breathing mask for over 2 minutes before removing the mask and disappearing from the view of the cameras placed on board. The figure did not appear anywhere else inside the plane. Another figure appeared 4 years later in 2001, sitting in the massive computer parts that made up the co-pilot's chair. This figure, much like its predecessor, was indistinct in its features. For almost 4 minutes, it sat in the cockpit of the Boeing 747-200, just whimpering softly. Then it lurched forward, vomiting all over the console in front of it, before quickly disappearing like the first figure. SCP personnel collected a sample of the vomit the entity left behind. After performing an analysis of the sample, research staff found traces of nitrous oxide, thorium, bird droppings, and 3 human fingernails. At present, the origin of these humanoid figures is still unknown. Could these entities be the souls of the dead passengers, trying to offer insight into what happened aboard this flight? Or perhaps these indistinct human-shaped creatures are the ones responsible for the deaths of SCP-787's passengers? The next anomaly within SCP-787 occurred in 2005, when a female voice was recorded speaking through the onboard speaker system. The voice said, "For your comfort and enjoyment today, pancakes will now be served. Please do not leave your seat. Pancakes will now be served. Please do not leave your seat. Do not leave your seat. Leave your seat. Please. Pancakes will now be served. Yay! Pancakes." Exactly what the relevance of pancakes are to a plane full of bodies is still under investigation by the SCP Foundation. Next, in 2007, the Boeing's overhead emergency air masks fell from the ceiling, only to be snatched back upwards. They continued deploying and retracting for 14 minutes, while the plane was simultaneously filled with the noise of screams. Finally, the only other notable anomaly took place a year later, when the onboard temperature with an SCP-787 dropped 33 degrees, from 20 to -13 Celsius in a matter of seconds. By the late 2000s, the Foundation's researchers was having little luck understanding the nature of SCP-787's anomalies. Instead, they turned their attention to identifying the bodies of the deceased passengers on board. Through the use of advanced forensics and population databases, these researchers attempted to determine where exactly these bodies had come from. Researchers still haven't determined if they all died on the plane, or if someone had exhumed them from graves before placing them aboard for some unknown reason. In fact, the answer was neither, and Foundation researchers discovered something that no one had expected. One of the passengers was still alive. To clarify, the body aboard SCP-787 was definitely still deceased, but researchers identified the cadaver as a retired optometrist from Atlanta, Georgia, who was still very much alive. Foundation agents found the man was simultaneously alive and well in his Atlanta home, but also dead on board the Boeing 747-200. The subject was interviewed by agents and had no prior knowledge of any incident taking place in June 1987. When SCP-787 was first discovered. Even more interestingly, he claimed that he never even set foot aboard an airplane, which his wife and son both confirmed to be true. So what does this mean? How could the same man have been alive in Georgia and dead aboard SCP-787? Perhaps the answer can be found in a surprising place: the plane's toilet, or to be more specific, the place where the things flushed in the toilet go to. Examinations of the airplane's waste storage tank have revealed something very surprising. There was one more SCP-787A specimen that had been overlooked. It is unknown just how he got in there, but researchers discovered the body of an Indian man who looked to be in his 30s. The man, who was wearing a 3-piece suit, was found to be carrying a number of puzzling items, including a surgical mask and gloves, an unloaded Beretta DT-10 shotgun, several cinnamon-flavored mints, a switchblade knife, an amulet that appears to depict the Eye of Horus, and a ticket stub for the Return of the Jedi with the number 92 written on the back. All of these objects seem to be completely random, and the Foundation has been unable to make sense of what they were doing on the man. or why his body does not seem to show the same state of decay as the rest of those found on board. There was one item that may hold some answers, though. For some reason, this man also possessed a copy of SCP-787's flight log. The log consisted of a series of coordinates, which were repeated 5,478 times. The coordinates point to a seemingly random spot in the Pacific Ocean, several hundred miles away from the infamous Pitcairn Islands, the island that the famous mutineers of the HMS Bounty settled after taking over the ship and leaving the captain adrift on the ocean. Is this location the secret to SCP-787? While none of this is confirmed nor denied by anyone at the SCP Foundation, one theory surrounding the area is that the location is another Bermuda Triangle-like location, one that contains some sort of temporal anomaly that unwitting planes fly through, only to find themselves displaced in time. Of course, the problem with this theory is that the man from Atlanta said he'd never been aboard a plane before. Or at least, not yet. It is entirely possible that SCP-787 is a plane that made a flight at some point in the not-too-distant future, only to arrive back in June 1987 by passing through a temporal breach in the area near the Pitcairn Islands. Sure, it might not explain what happened to everyone on board, but it could at least explain how SCP-787 arrived where and when it did. Every plane is fitted with a device that records flight data, in the event of a crash or other accident, known to most as the plane's black box, and researchers were able to uncover SCP-787s inside a compartment under one of the plane's seats. The recorder was found within a compartment filled with toxic asbestos and dried human blood. They hoped that perhaps it would contain some answers as to what exactly SCP-787 had come from and what had happened to its passengers. Sadly not. The flight data recorder contained no information besides one simple phrase, "To be sorry." While an inexplicable mystery, SCP-787 is at least classified as a safe anomaly by the Foundation, seeing as it poses no realistic threat or shows signs of trying to break out of containment. The aircraft has only ever caused harm to anyone trying to enter during one of its sporadic anomalous events. But apart from that, it sits gathering dust in a hangar, just waiting for someone to crack its secrets. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be sitting on a plane that's taking you to your South Pacific vacation, and the retired optometrist sitting next to you will remark that you're passing over the Pitcairn Islands, and you'll discover for yourself exactly what happened to SCP-787. The first thing that tips the Foundation off to SCP-087's presence were the reports of numerous unexplained disappearances on campus. There were plenty of rumors about what might be behind them, but field agents suspected that the true source of the vanishing would be something beyond civilian imagination. All anyone knew for sure was that everyone who had gone missing was last seen in a certain administrative building on the university grounds, and that the disappearances only seemed to happen when the elevator was out. The campus was soon flooded with Foundation agents, creating a barrier around the administrative building and the presumed habitat of SCP-087. Nobody else could get in, and hopefully whatever was inside couldn't get out. One of the Foundation's lead scientists was flown in to consult on the investigation. What could have been behind those students disappearing? The doctor's preliminary interviews with university staff who worked in the building yielded some interesting details. Strange noises, like banging and even a faint, shrill crying, would be heard from a door that led to a no longer used stairway in hallway 3B. Staff in the building had no reason to ever take these stairs, especially considering how many of them reported a strange sense of unease when just standing outside the dorm. The only reason someone might take those stairs is due to elevator malfunctions. In that instant, the doctor had put it all together. The staff they interviewed had their memory wiped with amnestics, special chemicals used by the Foundation with the power to delete human memories. The Foundation only used them for staff or civilians who had confirmed contact with an SCP, and the doctor knew that they had a live one on their hands. The staircase. There was something terribly wrong with that staircase, and it was the SCP Foundation's job to find out what, before it made anybody else disappear. This is the story of SCP-087, otherwise known as the Endless Staircase, and the 3 doomed journeys down into its murky depths. The doctor was more than eager to begin research into the staircase and its frightening, anomalous properties. After all, you don't claw your way up to being one of the Foundation's key researchers without being brave. and perhaps just a little bit deranged. As was standard, once a perimeter was secured around the staircase, the good doctor requested a selection of D-Class personnel for testing. For those not in the know, D-Class is the Foundation's polite way of saying cannon fodder. The doctor was sent 3 D-Class prisoners for use in his investigation of SCP-087. The first, D-8432, was, according to official documentation on the incident, a 43-year-old male of average build and appearance and unremarkable psychological background. This man once worked for the Foundation in a more official capacity, but he was given the often deadly demotion to D-Class due to a dangerous mistake handling SCP-682 that led to the deaths of several other agents. Now, it looked like it would be his turn. The doctor explained his mission to him: explore the staircase, gather data, help us find out exactly what we're dealing with here. If you come back alive, there may even be a promotion in it for you. And with that promise, D-8432 was given his loadout, a 75-watt flood lamp with battery power capable of lasting 24 hours, an audio headset, and a handheld camcorder fitted with a transmission stream, and an audio headset that would allow him to communicate with Dr. Bright. D-8432 was then pushed through the door in hallway 3B and out onto the staircase. According to declassified Foundation files describing the staircase, SCP-087 is an unlit platform staircase. Stairs descend on a 38-degree angle for 13 steps before reaching a semicircular platform of approximately 3 meters in diameter. Descent direction rotates 180 degrees at each platform. The design of SCP-087 limits subjects to a visual range of approximately 1.5 flights. But in D-8432's mind, unlit really didn't seem like the right word. He would have chosen all-consuming darkness. Despite carrying a powerful 75-watt lamp, D-8432 was only capable of partially lighting the platform he was standing on, and the illumination only stretched down 9 of the 13 steps to the next platform. When D-8432 observed how little help his lamp was giving him, he was instructed to shine it out of the doorway into hallway 3B. When he did so, the light seemed to shine far further than it ever could in SCP-087. Already, the beginning of the anomalous activity was obvious. Everywhere else, darkness is just the absence of light. In SCP-087, darkness eats light. It was like a tangible black mass that only a certain amount of light could survive, while the rest just wouldn't show. D-8432 swallowed hard over a lump in his throat. The door to hallway 3B was closed behind him, and he was ordered to descend. Surviving to see that promotion was feeling unlikely, but it's not like he had a choice. If he tried to escape SCP-087 before he was permitted, he'd be shot by SCP Foundation field agents on the spot. So he followed the high-ranking doctor's orders and began to descend the steps to the next platform. Nothing about the physical makeup of the staircase itself seemed abnormal. The base and walls were a very plain, dull concrete with a metal handrail. The only thing that seemed unique about it so far was the strange light-bending properties. That was, until he reached the second platform down and he heard it, a soft, echoing cry. A child's cry. It was shrieks of panic, or maybe even pain, echoing up from below. He was asked why he had stopped, and he explained the crying sound he'd been hearing. It sounded like it was coming from far down the stairs, maybe 200 meters below him. He could just make out the words please, help, and down here coming from the darkness. But the team outside the stairwell couldn't hear anything, so they asked him to descend further. Another platform down, and they could hear it too, the unmistakable cries of a terrified child. Please, help, and down here. D-8432 was ordered to keep going, and only stop if he noticed changes to the visual environment or in the sounds he was hearing. D-8432, knowing his life was on the line, had to keep going, and descended another 20 flights of stairs before stopping to remark that the sounds of the child hadn't gotten any closer. They still sounded just as far away as when he'd first heard them. He was told his observations were noted and pressured to continue. Within half an hour, D-8432 had descended a full 50 floors, with no sign of a bottom in sight. Somehow, the volume of the child's crying had remained consistent throughout, as if it was moving away from D-8432 at the same rate he was descending. At this point, D-8432 reported that he was feeling uneasy. The doctor said that this was understandable, given the circumstances. He'd been watching what little there was to see over a live video feed the entire time, and something about the truly bottomless nature of the staircase and the ever-elusive crying was undeniably eerie. But things were about to really take a turn for the worst. As D8432 stepped forward towards the next set of stairs, he froze. There was something on the platform below him, barely illuminated by the light of his 75-watt bulb. It was a face, vaguely human in size and shape, but with a few terrifying differences. It had grayish skin and no mouth, nostrils, or pupils. And yet, D8432 could feel that this thing was making eye contact with him. He couldn't move, trapped in the thing's piercing gaze. In an instant, the face jerked forwards, suddenly only about a foot away from D432's face, eyes staring into its own. D8432 screamed and ran, scaling all 50 flights in an astonishing 18 minutes before charging out into hallway 3B. There, he collapsed from the exhaustion and the fear of what he'd just seen. Upon reviewing the footage, the strange face was designated SCP-087-1. Fascinating. It was time for a second experiment. The doctor just had to know more. The second test subject was D9035, a 28-year-old male with a history of aggravated assaults against women. He was given the same loadout as his predecessors, except this time with an even more powerful 100-watt bulb. He was also given 100 small LED lights that had adhesive backs and a battery life of approximately 3 weeks, with which they intended to permanently illuminate SCP-087. However, despite the extra wattage of his bulb, he still couldn't illuminate beyond the 9th step. SCP-087 wouldn't allow it. Having no ideas of the horrors that lurked below him, he descended on the doctor's orders and began fixing the LEDs to the walls of each platform he passed. The LED always illuminated the landing, but the light couldn't pass the first step on either side. The flights of stairs themselves would remain in perpetual darkness. After the second flight, D9035 noticed the same crying D8432 had heard and became uneasy. Just like before, as D9035 descended, the volume of the crying didn't seem to increase, as if for every step he descended, the source of the crying descended 1 too, keeping them at a constant 200 meters apart. Still, he was ordered to continue his descent and the placing of LEDs even as his paranoia grew. When he reached the 51st floor, he observed damage to the wall and steps. Sections appeared to have been smashed to rubble by an extreme force. As he descended past the broken step, he only felt his fear, anxiety, and paranoia grow. The doctor made note of the fact that SCP-087 seemed to cause instances of anxiety and terror in its occupants, even before they encountered SCP-087-1. As D9035 reached Platform 89, a full 350 meters under the initial platform, he stopped dead in his tracks and saw something staring up at him from the platform below. That same terrible gray face with those dead white eyes. He was encouraged to stay calm and try to get better footage of the face, but it charged for him, and D9035 ran for his life. He ascended the staircase at a staggering pace, even passing out from exhaustion and remaining motionless for 14 minutes halfway. When D9035 finally gathered the strength to get up, he scrambled back to hallway 3B and fell into a state of catatonia. He remains unresponsive to all external stimuli to this day, just staring off into the distance with a haunted expression, almost like he's still there in the hallway. The doctor wanted to conduct one more test before he ordered SCP-087 shut off from the world forever. And it was the most terrifying of all. The final subject was D9884, a 23-year-old woman with a history of depression and use of excessive force. The doctor had hoped that D9884 would travel the deepest yet, and so he gave her the additional supplies of a backpack containing 3.75 liters of water, 15 nutrient bars, and 1 thermal blanket. As far as the Foundation was concerned, she was in this for the long haul. But none of them had any idea quite how right they were. When D9884 entered SCP-087, all the lights from the previous expedition had disappeared. Still, she was ordered to go deeper. She heard the crying of the mysterious child, if it was even a child at all, and again she was ordered to go deeper. At the 496th landing, even as D9884 seemed to slip into a state of mortal terror, once again she was ordered to go even deeper. Every moment, he was hoping to get a better look at the face of SCP-087-1, and when D9884 finally broke and fled back upstairs, he did. The face appeared, but this time, it was mere inches behind her, staring directly into the camera with its blank eyes, startling even this veteran of the supernatural. The face appearing caused D9884 to panic and flee, but instead of going back up the stairs to safety, she went deeper down the staircase in an attempt to escape it, deeper and deeper and deeper, until her video feed cut out. D9884 was never seen again. In the aftermath of the tests, the SCP was classified as Euclid. It may have been dangerous, but at least it was easy to contain. The door to hallway 3B was replaced with one made out of reinforced steel with an electro-release lock mechanism. It has been disguised to resemble a janitorial closet consistent with the rest of the building. The lock won't release unless a classified number of electrical volts are applied, while the key is turned counterclockwise. And after a few inches of foam insulation were applied to the inner side of the door, staff at the building never again reported hearing strange noises. As for the fates of those lost within the endless turning flights and platforms of SCP-087, we may never know, but one can only assume it isn't pleasant. It was a beautiful September day, but Sean Taylor was trapped in his car in one of the worst cases of gridlock he had ever seen. He tried to look on the bright side though, and while he was stuck in an unmoving car, at least he had a pleasant view of the wide, shimmering lake just off the road next to him. He was admiring the scene when tiny drops of rain started landing on his windshield. That's funny. There wasn't a cloud in the sky a moment ago. There was something off about the rain though. It looked dirty, a rusty red color. Was that blood? He didn't have time to think about it, because just then a thick, dense mist began to roll over the lake, a fog of blood. Just off the side of the road, he could see a huge silhouette rising out of the water. Is that an old submarine? What Sean didn't know was that he was about to have an encounter with SCP-1861, also known as the HMS Wintersheimer, a ghostly submarine with strange and terrifying effects. Sean and the other drivers stuck in traffic that day were far from the first people to have a dangerous brush with this legendary vessel. According to SCP Foundation records, the HMS Wintersheimer has been appearing since as early as 1916. The first recorded incident occurred in the British seaside town of Innsmouth-on-Sea. You won't find this town on any maps or in the history books, and you're about to find out why. The 500 population of the town, which had already reduced by the wartime draft into the currently raging Great World War, awoke to red skies on February 6, 1916. Citizens left their homes to investigate, only to find their entire town had been enveloped in a thick red mist. The swelling crimson clouds up ahead began to rain, showering the town in a hail of viscous red goop. Anyone unlucky enough to taste it would say that this strange rain was a dreadful mix of salt and copper. This was because, as the Foundation would later determine, the rain and fog was a disgusting combination of salt water, human blood, and human cerebrospinal fluid. But the real threat was rising just beyond the beach. Technically speaking, the HMS Wintersheimer vessel is designated as SCP-1861-A. It appears to be a World War I-era British B-class submarine, designed by Vickers for the Royal Navy in 1904. By 1916, this particular type of boat was already on its way to being obsolete, and were largely deployed in Malta, far from the active fronts. So one of these vessels appearing on an otherwise unremarkable stretch of English coastline should have been a clue that something was terribly wrong. But the poor residents of Innsmouth-on-Sea didn't know the half of it. Soon, figures in what appeared to be archaic diving gear began emerging from the Wintersheimer and made their way into the township. They seemed terrified, running up to and frantically screaming at any local they could find. "Please listen to me. Something terrible is about to happen here. We need you to come with us or you're all going to die. You must believe us." The locals were frightened by what they heard. They'd been listening to news reports of the Great War unfolding across the globe for 2 years now. Had it finally come to them? They pictured shells raining down from the sky, decimating their defenseless little town in a rain of fire. The Navy must have been brought in to save them before the German bombardment began. While some took more convincing than others, the men in diving suits, known as SCP-1861-B, eventually managed to persuade the entire town to join them and lead the townspeople down to the water. One by one, they were all boarded onto the submarine, hundreds of them, Many couldn't believe their eyes as they watched scores of people disappear in front of them into the dark bowels of the Wintersheimer. Where were they all going? How would they all fit in there? But it was too late for any of them to back out now. The vessel submerged once more, and everyone was gone. The entire population of Innsmouth-on-Sea had disappeared in a rain of fog and blood, never to be seen again. The Foundation wiped all records of the town from existence and delivered appropriate amnestic treatment to anyone who still mentioned or remembered Innsmouth-on-Sea. The fate of those who board the HMS Wintersheimer is always the same: vanish from the face of the earth, explained away by the Foundation as accidental death by extreme weather event. There have been hundreds of documented sightings of SCP-1861, and the anomalous weather event can occur near any body of water wide enough to accommodate SCP-1861-A's comms tower and topmost platform. Depth does not seem to be any hindrance of the submarine appearing, and it can even manifest in water that's just a few inches deep. As Sean and the other unfortunate victims of the rush hour traffic were being showered in thick red droplets from above, a crimson mist rolled in between the cars. Sean had heard of so-called freak weather events before, like raining frogs and fish, but this was something different, and it frightened him. He could see now that the silhouette rising from the lake really was an old submarine, and he watched as a legion of mysterious figures disembarked from the vessel and began spilling onto the road. The men in ancient-looking diving suits walked among the cars, and one of them approached Sean's car. He began tapping frantically on the window, and Sean could tell he was yelling something. Sean was scared and more, but more than anything else, he was confused. Against his better judgment, he rolled down the window just a crack to hear what the man was saying. His British accented voice muted by the diving suit, the man frantically told him, "Sir, please listen to me. I'm Lieutenant Samuel Ramsey of the HMS Wintersheimer. We're evacuating the area. Please, you've got to come with me. We're in danger out here." HMS? Sean thought. Isn't that what they call British ships? What was a British submarine doing in the middle of a lake in the United States? Through his windshield, Sean could already see other men in diving suits leading people from the cars out towards the submarine. Something had to be going on here, something big. Lieutenant Ramsey was still banging away at the glass of Sean's window, becoming increasingly agitated. "Sir, if you won't comply with my orders, I'm within my rights to take you by force for your own safety." Sean could feel the fear setting in, but he didn't know what else to do. He turned off the car and took off his seatbelt. He was just about to open the door when there was a tap on the passenger side window of his car. It was a soldier in what looked to be advanced tactical gear. There were several soldiers directing cars to drive on the shoulder to get around the mess of stopped automobiles. Sean looked to his left, and the man in the diving suit was gone. The soldier tapped again, and Sean didn't need to be told twice. He followed his directions and drove around the traffic jam and out of the mist. A half-mile down the road, Sean was stopped by another group of soldiers and given an amnestic. He drove away, never knowing how close he had come to vanishing in the bowels of SCP-1861-A. Sean was lucky that one of the SCP Foundation's mobile task forces had taken over the situation, but they were too late to help those who had already complied with SCP-1861-B's orders and boarded the Wintersheimer. The task force made it their business to save whoever they could, but that wasn't their only directive. The Foundation had recorded a huge number of SCP-1861 instances since 1916, and now they were finally going to figure out what was going on inside. The Foundation had already discovered that those taken onto the Wintersheimer don't simply disappear. Once on board the submarine, they are forced into a diving suit of their own, which transforms them into new instances of SCP-1861-B. Upon realizing this, Foundation scientists devised an ingenious plot. 6 months before this latest instance of 1861, the Foundation dispatched 2 members of D-Class personnel who were familiar with one another into the Red Mist. One was instructed not to interact with SCP-1861-B, while the other, named Sal, was ordered to enter the submarine. His mission was to report back all findings to Foundation researcher Dr. Clutch during the next 1861 event. The D-Class who remained on shore was brought in once more by the Mobile Task Force during the September event that Sean witnessed. They checked each diving suit wearing anomaly until they heard a familiar voice, muffled by the mask. It was Sal, and he'd been transformed into an instance of SCP-1861-B. The human D-Class, receiving questions from Dr. Clutch via remote broadcast, commenced the interview of his former friend. It is from this vital interview that much of the Foundation's knowledge of the mysterious HMS Wintersheimer is drawn. According to Sal, the interior of the Wintersheimer, which is a long, narrow passageway, is a spatial anomaly that seems to stretch on forever. This explains how vast number of people, like the entire population of Innsmouth-on-Sea, can disappear into the submarine at once. Sal reported that, about an hour after entering the vessel, the hatch closed and the interior began rapidly filling with water as the submarine descended. Prisoners of the Wintersheimer were faced with two choices: suit up or drown. Few chose the latter option, and as soon as the suit was on, the transformation had begun. As soon as everyone was suited up and the submarine had fully descended, causing the 1861 weather event to dissipate on Earth, the Wintersheimer had effectively entered an alternate dimension. The airlock opened, and the new recruits were instructed to step outside and take a look around. The Wintersheimer veterans informed the new sailors that everyone on land was likely already dead by this point. When Sal first exited the submarine, he commented on everything around him looking eerily similar to how it looked on land before the mist descended, but with one key difference. It seemed as though everything was underwater. Well, not quite that. It was almost as though everything was water, like the world had taken on a kind of flowing liquid state. Sal and the others existed in this otherworldly land of living water for 6 months, and as the months passed, things only got stranger. They found that they neither needed to eat nor sleep. According to Sal, all they did was breathe and pass the time by exploring and talking to one another. Anyone who attempted to take off their suit would dissolve and diffuse into the same liquid that surrounded them. Dr. Clutch asked Sal about the other inhabitants of this alien realm, and this was when things got truly disturbing. There were dead humans and animals floating all over the place, missing their eyes as though they'd been scooped out, and missing their mouths, as though they'd been bitten out of their face by some kind of huge predator. Their empty eye sockets bled constantly, and Sal theorized that this may have something to do with the anomalous blood mists of SCP-1861. When asked to provide more information on why all the corpses were mutilated in this way, Sal said that one of his superiors on the Wintersheimer told him, "The watcher of eyes and biter of teeth deemed them worthy." Whatever this mysterious being was, it seemed to be a powerful figure within 1861's waterworld, and Sal felt lucky that he never had a direct run-in with the creature himself. For his final request, Dr. Clutch asked Sal to attempt to remove his suit. The Foundation had learned in previous instances of 1861 that the diving suits have anomalous durability, and it was impossible for anyone other than the wearer to remove them. Hence why the Foundation could never deal with 1861-B by using brute force. Naturally, Clutch was interested in finding out what was going on underneath. Sal expressed fear and anxiety at first, wondering if after all he'd been through, whether he could ever be considered human anymore. Eventually, he was convinced to remove the suit, and his worst fears were confirmed. The second Sal removed his helmet, gallons of seawater poured out, and the now empty suit collapsed to the ground. Sal's body was never found. Only some teeth and a pair of eyes were recovered. The eyes were later confirmed to be belonging to a young girl, and the teeth were identified as having come from a European red deer. And so, the dark mystery of the HMS Wintersheimer continues. Because of the unpredictable nature of its appearances and the resulting difficulty of containing it, the Wintersheimer has earned a Keter classification. The only containment procedure currently employed by the SCP Foundation is for mobile task forces to try and intercept the submarine when appearances are reported, and hopefully prevent or at least reduce the kidnapping of civilians. With so many questions left unanswered, all we can say for certain is that if a red mist ever descends on you, and a stranger in a diving suit tells you you're in grave danger, he's absolutely right. It's the late 90s, and an Air Canada flight experiences severe malfunctions while traveling from London to Vancouver. The pilots are unable to do anything and the plane crashes into the woods of northern Alberta. The crash was devastating. Only 10 of the nearly 300 people on board are alive. And even though they survived the initial disaster, their battle for life has only just begun. It's late autumn in northern Canada, and there's no telling when help will arrive, if at all. If the survivors want to make it through the night, they need to find shelter, and fast. As they trudge through the freezing woods, the group finds a path that looks like it might lead them to civilization. After all, if there was a path in the woods, that meant they were probably in a national park. And if they were in a national park, there had to be a ranger station around somewhere where they could warm up and call for help. They didn't have many other options, so they followed the path which opened up to a clearing. But instead of finding a ranger station or campground, they found something none of them could have expected. It was a pond, but there was something off about it. As they got closer, they saw that this strange pond wasn't filled with water, but blood. The survivors were horrified. That couldn't really be blood, could it? It must have been a weird algae or chemical reaction. But one member of the group, a man named Thomas Dean, who had been on his way back to his hometown of Prince George, British Columbia, thought there was something strangely familiar about this. He remembered being a boy and going to visit family in Alberta, and hearing an urban legend from the older local kids. According to the stories, somewhere out in the wilderness, in the northern part of the province, there was a pond full of human blood. And what made it even worse was that some said the pond was a gateway to hell. The SCP Foundation was also aware of this legend and had been trying to pinpoint the exact source of it for decades prior to the Air Canada crash. They would finally receive definite confirmation of the blood pond when Foundation personnel intercepted a radio transmission from a ranger station located within the Wood Buffalo National Park. It was the survivors of the crash who had managed to make it through the night, and they were about to be escorted out of the park by rangers. The Foundation mobilized quickly to cordon off the pond, as at the time they were unsure of what potentially harmful properties the pond might have had. They set up Watch Station Epsilon 38 and put staff on guard to deter travelers from the area. The pond was given the designation of SCP-354 and classed as Euclid. Foundation scientists made a number of interesting discoveries about SCP-354 when they collected samples for testing. First, the pond was not in fact full of blood, merely an inorganic liquid that closely resembles blood in color and consistency. Second, and even stranger than the red liquid, is that the pond doesn't seem to have any definite banks or a bottom. Instead, the liquid in the pond increases in density as the radius away from the center increases. The liquid congeals at the edges, becoming more solid and blending into the surrounding soil. It also becomes thicker as one descends deeper into the pool, and the bottom of the pond has not yet been reached, if it even exists. Initially, the Foundation found no signs of life within the blood pond, but that would all change at 2:03 p.m. on the day following the opening of Watch Station Epsilon 38. When the science team noticed an unusual level of activity on the pond's surface. Security footage feeds showed a shape rising out of the pond, followed by a deafening shriek. After that, the feed was cut and Foundation lost all communication with Watch Station Epsilon 38. Fearing the worst, a mobile task force was dispatched to the location. When they got there, all personnel at the Watch Station had been killed by what could only be described as a gigantic bat. The task force was able to neutralize the entity, and as soon as they could, the Foundation moved in to increase security around the SCP, creating Area 354 and installing a permanent security detail. After this point, the pond started to regularly spit out a variety of monstrous entities, almost as if it was reacting to the SCP Foundation's increased security measures. After SCP-354-1, the giant bat, came SCP-354-2. 354-2 was an echidna-like monster the size of a bear that was virtually bulletproof but unable to escape Area 354. The Foundation neutralized this anomaly with napalm. SCP-354-3 was a floating black sphere capable of firing deadly beams of concentrated energy. The area's head scientist was able to hit it with a sledgehammer, causing the sphere to malfunction and self-destruct before it was able to escape the area. The Foundation wasn't as lucky with SCP-354-4. This creature was a reptilian humanoid that stood roughly 15 feet tall and was unable to be put down with gunfire. This was the first creature from the pond to successfully escape containment and was only able to be neutralized when the Foundation sent in Mobile Task Force Omega-7, also known as Pandora's Box. The data on pond incursions is partially corrupted, so a complete list of creatures is not available. But some of the other monsters that came out of the blood pond include a killer robot, a set of gigantic tentacles that drag several D-Class personnel into the pond, a pair of panther-like creatures, one made of ice and the other of magma, that ignored Foundation staff and instead fought each other, and one seemingly normal human man who was executed as soon as he emerged from the pond. Tests on his body revealed that he was, in fact, totally normal and would have posed no threat. These anomalies came out of the pond at fairly regular intervals for several months, before the pond went silent for an unprecedented 22 months. The head scientist at the time noted, "I suspect this means one of two things. Either the red pool has died or powered down, or whatever the correct term for it is, or is charging up for something big to come through. O5 believes the former is the most likely explanation, and has recalled 30% of our total personnel and cut 25% of our funding. While I can only hope that they are correct, if the latter situation is true, we're soon to face some terrible monstrosity and we won't have anywhere near the force necessary to deal with it. I worry for all of our safety." His words would prove eerily prophetic following the events of Exploratory Mission 354 Alpha. The Foundation's research and development team built a specialized craft to explore the pond. Because of the strange properties of the pond's density, the craft was essentially made to be both a submarine, for parts of the pond where the contents were liquid, and a drill, for when the liquid congealed into a semi-solid towards the bottom. The exploration team consisted of Agent Swanson, Agent Turquoise, Agent 86, Dr. J. MacArthur, Chris Simmons, Leroy Tucker, and a pilot named Martin. With the team assembled, the ship was sent down into the pond. Nothing eventful happened for the first 2 days of the mission, but at 4:30 a.m. on the third day, gravity suddenly reversed for the crew of the ship. This seemed to indicate that they were approaching the halfway point, though what would be on the other side, nobody could say. On the fourth day, the ship surfaced, proving definitely that the pond was in fact some sort of portal. The crew looked out of the portholes to see the darkness of night above them. While sensors outside the ship detected nothing harmful in the atmosphere around them, the crew were wary of exiting the craft. The other side of the pond was nothing like the world the crew knew. For one thing, the night lasted for 28 hours before dawn came, and when the sun finally rose, it was much larger and redder than the Earth's sun. Under the light of the strange red star, the crew could see that the pond on this side was massive compared to what they've come into, more like a large lake. Surrounding the lake was sand and rocks that were covered in a kind of moss that disappeared under sunlight and regrew during the night. The team left the ship and started to explore. During their time in this strange world, they found that the day lasted just a few hours shorter than the night, meaning that whatever planet they were on had a roughly 43-hour-long rotation as opposed to our own planet's 24. The team found a number of anomalous elements on their expedition, including razor-sharp grass that can puncture skin and streams of liquid carbon dioxide. They heard some loud roars in the distance once or twice, but other than that, the planet was eerily silent, with seemingly no animal life and not even wind. When it rained, the soil remained dry, and based on that, the scientists theorized the plants in this world were more efficient at absorbing moisture. On the 25th day, the team ran into a huge metal wall that appeared to be artificially constructed. Luckily, Leroy Tucker, a quick-thinking researcher, was able to rig a blowtorch from camping supplies and melt a hole through the metal. On the other side, there was finally wind and odd black grass. That's the extent of what is known about the other side of the wall, because the expedition logs are heavily corrupted after that point. But we know that whatever was in there wasn't good, because the team never returned. Strangely, there's no record of any names mentioned in the ship's log, almost as if being killed on the other side completely erased them from history. No other expeditions into the pond were launched after that. On an undisclosed date, a year following the discovery of the Blood Pond and construction of Area 354, the site was completely evacuated, and power was cut to the area. Mobile Task Force Data 12 was dispatched to investigate the cause of the evacuation, but before contact could be established, the area's on-site nuclear warhead was detonated, completely destroying the site. MTF Data 12 was then attacked by a convoy made up of D-Class and other low-ranking staff who had evacuated Area 354. It was apparent that there had been some kind of mutiny within the site, and that a dissolution of the chain of command had led to its evacuation and destruction. The convoy totally annihilated MTF Data 12, and no further contact with the former personnel of Area 354 has been made since. Following the site's detonation, a new site was constructed called simply the Red Pool Containment Site. Unlike the previous facility, which focused on research and neutralization, the new site is entirely concerned with containment. The shift in directive came as a response to the pond's apparent reactive nature nature. Each creature that emerged from the pond seemed to be in retaliation to the Foundation's actions, and it was theorized by some that the mutiny at Area 354 was triggered by some kind of psychic attack from the pond itself. An interview in the SCP file on 354 reveals that there was one more disastrous attempt to control and understand the blood pond. According to an interview with a Foundation agent, the head doctor proposed a scheme to drain the blood pond using a system of pumps and hoses. All non-essential personnel were evacuated in case of emergency, leaving only the pump technicians, D-class personnel, and a few agents for security. However, as soon as the pump was scheduled to be turned on, everyone at the site experienced a mass dissociative episode. The agent described the feeling they all experienced as like being in a dream and suddenly realizing that you're asleep. He said, "Everything stopped being real. It was like we had to escape right now." When asked what happened when the pump was turned on, he simply explained that it wouldn't let them. This interview confirmed the theory that the pond is not only capable of releasing monsters out into our world, but also that it's capable of powerful but much more subtle psychological attacks. This suggests a chilling possibility, that the pond isn't just blindly reacting to being attacked, but it's fully sentient, and the actions of the SCP Foundation have only served to annoy it. And worst, studies of the pond's banks have proved evidence that the area of congealed liquid around the perimeter of the pond has been steadily expanding. That's right, the pond is getting bigger. The last thing the Foundation agent stationed at the site said before being dragged out of the interview and sedated was, "It gets bigger and stronger every day, and now we've made it angry." Does the Black Moon howl? No, not yet. See the boy. He was born in a time before names. There weren't enough humans around to need them back then. He was one of a handful occupying a coastal village, using a tongue long since dead. They eked out a simple life, hunting, gathering, fishing. The only thing on most of their minds was surviving to see the next sunrise. Yes, a simple life, free of complications. Until the hermit appeared. The boy would remember this man for eternity. Haggard and thin, skin weathered by time and pain. A man that, emaciated, walking with a long, gnarled cane that honestly looked healthier than he did, shouldn't be alive. Even the boy, who had scarcely seen beyond the bounds of his village, knew that the hermit was unnatural, an aberration, an anomaly. He walked into the center of the village, sat down on a large stone, and waited. Nobody dared ask his business, nor what the hermit waited for. Then, a few days later, the Black Moon howled. The boy saw the village's youngest hunter freeze one evening while out on a walk. Not simply stand still, but freeze. Then, for an instant, he became solid black, a coal statue, and as soon as he'd changed, he was gone. Obliterated, not a trace of him remained. Such is the power of the Black Moon. It can make any conscious being disappear in an instant, turn black, then wiped from our plane of existence, never to be seen again. Its choice of victims seemed at each instance to be utterly random, but it would come for all who lived eventually. This is known to some as the howling of the Black Moon. Later that same night, the boy found himself talking to the hermit, who asked with small, frantic eyes what he had seen. When the boy told him, he let out a deep, rattling sigh. The boy, curious, asked him if he knew about the nightmare he'd just witnessed. The hermit looked up. He'd been the first one in the hermit's millennia of pursuit that had ever asked. In that moment, he knew that he had found his successor in the hunt for the death of ages. The hermit told the boy it went by many names. The Great Finale, the Pale King, but most common of all was the Black Moon. The entity existed beyond the veil of our reality, a creature of pure energy, though nobody could really be sure of its true nature. The hermit had been tracking it, learning about it, and trying to destroy it for thousands of years. And yet it only took him 4 pathetic minutes to tell the boy everything he knew. The boy, knowing still that something about the hermit was unnatural, asked how he came to be in this position. The hermit told the boy he was the counterbalance, a kind of chosen one. destined to face and perhaps even defeat the Black Moon someday. The Counterbalance receives a number of truly extraordinary gifts for inheriting the responsibility: eternal life, eternal youth, near physical immortality. But they will be haunted by their purpose, doomed to watch everyone they love die around them, as they continue to hunt their only true equal and opposite, the Black Moon itself. The hermit in his own eyes had failed at his duty. He had grown weary, and now he needed to pass the duty of counterbalance on to another. That other would be the boy. He felt a sudden and profound change, along with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. He was no longer just the boy. Now, he was the counterbalance. He watched the hermit give him a slight nod of respect and then crumble into dust before his eyes. The boy, the counterbalance, looked up at the sky and saw the stars twinkling, so bright and so beautiful. Little did he know his battle with the Black Moon would outlast every single one of them. Does the Black Moon howl? Not without blood. The boy grew into a man as his village aged and then died around him. Decades passed, then centuries, then millennia. Tens of thousands of years watching humanity develop and grow around him as he continued his pursuit of that one elusive foe. As science and diagnostic technology gained ground, absorbing and then evolving beyond all the old superstitions, the counterbalance gained a better understanding of the Black Moon, though even then, it still remained essentially a stranger. The entity was entropic, a being of pure randomness and chaos without consistent form. It didn't exist in our universe, but it could exercise its influence here with so-called obliteration events, much like the horrible fate that befell the young hunter from the village. But that was only the proverbial tip of the iceberg. The counterbalance tracked and noted obliteration events. They were exceedingly rare at first, something that occurred once every 1,000 years or so, like a terrible curse. But he couldn't help but notice a concerning trend emerging. It started happening once a century, then once a decade. He could feel the terrible future stretching out in front of him. How, over their shared eternity, the Black Moon would gain more and more ground. Would there come a day where it took someone once a year, once a month, a week, a day, an hour, a minute, a second? It'd spell the end of all conscious life, a total victory for the Black Moon, the end of the universe, the death of ages, a complete existential obliteration. He was swept up in a sobering realization. He couldn't win this fight alone. However, while his hunt for the Black Moon had been largely fruitless, the counterbalance had discovered many other things along the way. Strange creatures, objects with extraordinary powers, and events that couldn't be explained with rational science. Perhaps something about these oddities, these anomalies, would hold the key to defeating his timeless enemy. And it hadn't just been these objects, entities, and events. He'd also discovered some truly exceptional people on his travels, minds and skills that rivaled even his own, despite his age. Perhaps they would be the ones to help him win. With the 13 most brilliant and trusted people the counterbalance ever met, he decided to form a council. And from this council, they forged and directed an organization dedicated to understanding and counteracting the strange in all its forms, with the secret hope that their search into darkness would yield the answer to the Black Moon's downfall. He called it the SCP Foundation. They would secure the anomalous, contain it, and protect all of humanity from its influence. The counterbalance also took on a new title, befitting of his new role, the Administrator. And even the Black Moon itself was given a moniker, in hopes of robbing it of some of its frightening power. SCP-001. Does the Black Moon howl? Only at the blind. The year was now 1987. The SCP Foundation had been operating for over a century, and thanks to their secret possession of anomalous wisdom and technology, Their own advancement was thousands of years ahead of the rest of humanity. While there still wasn't a silver bullet solution to the Black Moon, and its deadly howls were becoming all the more frequent as the decades went on, the Foundation did have some irons in the fire to combat it. Their ability to gather intel on both the entity itself and its obliteration events had improved considerably, thanks to their new global information network. Their top minds were also working on a highly classified device known as the Singular Conceptual Bunker, which may one day come in handy for combating the extra-dimensional entity directly. But the most valuable piece of information they ever gathered about the Black Moon was this: it couldn't howl when it was being watched. The very act of engaged observation defanged it. The problem is, how can you observe something that doesn't technically exist inside your own reality? In order to pull this off, the Foundation would need to get extremely creative. Thankfully, creative solutions to strange problems are the Foundation's specialty. Flash forward to 1993. Enter Dr. Moto, a brilliant young scientist and conceptual engineer working for the SCP Foundation. With the administrator's consultation, he started the Key Project, an arm of the wider Project Oromasdes, the umbrella initiative for using modified anomalous objects in the battle against the Black Moon. The goal of the Key Project was relatively simple. If people couldn't observe the Black Moon directly, then the Foundation could make proxies of the Black Moon that could be observed, almost like a kind of voodoo doll. These new anomalies would only need to satisfy 3 criteria: the inability to operate when being observed, a hostility to conscious life, and the ability to end conscious life of their own volition when not being observed. Through conceptual engineering, a link theoretically could be forged between these objects and the Black Moon, allowing observation of them to stop the obliteration events. However, despite being a good idea in theory, Dr. Moto's efforts were marred with errors and tragedies. One object wasn't deadly enough, simply appearing behind people in a threatening pose when they weren't looking. Another one killed purely through collateral damage, a giant sculpture of a human head that immediately attempted escape by barging through Site-01, the Center for Anti-Black Moon Operations, and killing 19 people in the process. Another one of Moto's objects, a huge black sphere, simply immediately exploded, killing 12 people. And in the most horrific misstep of all, one of Moto's objects caused a mass death event in a nearby hotel, where 142 people were spontaneously incinerated when the object, a series of interlocking stalactites and stalagmites, were left unobserved for 0.2 seconds. Almost all of Moto's objects were terminated in the aftermath, either being too useless or too dangerous to keep around. The young scientist felt a deep shame, but forged on. He made one truly brilliant creation that satisfied all the criteria: a sculpture incapable of moving while being watched, but would snap the neck of the nearest conscious entity if it left unobserved for even a fraction of a second. Its relatively minimal killing left it easy to contain without causing mass deaths, and despite all of the other deaths that had sadly occurred during the Key Project, Dr. Moto believed that the lives saved in the long run by stopping the Black Moon's howls would justify the sacrifice. The problem is, the Key Project didn't stop anything. Not long after this, there was the first recorded double obliteration event in Rome, where a young tourist couple had both been obliterated simultaneously. All the deaths in the Key Project had been for nothing. The Black Moon was only getting more powerful. The shame and the guilt was too much for Dr. Moto. He left a note in his office reading, "We've been looking at nothing. I'm sorry, Administrator. I failed you, sir." Moto's corpse was later found in the sculpture's temporary containment chamber. His neck snapped. The Key Project was, in summary, shut down, and its one surviving creation transported to Site-19 in late 1993, where it was designated as SCP-173. Another painful failure for the Administrator. Back to the drawing board once more. Does the Black Moon howl? Not while the stars shine. Millennia stretched on. Almost everyone died except the Administrator thanks to his gift, or perhaps curse, as the counterbalance to the Black Moon. Science marched on. The SCP Foundation marched on. But all this progress, all this power, was nothing against the incomprehensible influence of SCP-001. The Black Moon was howling more frequently than ever, all the way up to the year 3156, when the Foundation launched the Seek project under the support of Project Oromastes. As more and more people were wiped out in frequent obliteration events, the administrator became painfully aware that perhaps the answers to the Black Moon problem wouldn't be found on Earth. Using state-of-the-art technology, with a little help from the anomalous, the SCP Foundation began work on an autonomous spacefaring vessel that could search the stars for the key to the Black Moon's destruction. It was an awe-inspiring creation, a huge craft powered by artificial intelligence with a universal translator, cryogenic units, and hundreds of autonomous drones to perform more targeted searches. Seek was waved off into the unforgiving depths of space. The administrator could only hope that it would come back with worthwhile answers. The first of the 3 notable planets Seek arrived on was one theoretically capable of supporting human life, except for its brutal and constant blizzards and snowstorms. When Seek's drones were deployed, they did discover signs of civilization based around sentient spherical creatures, but no signs of actual life remained. Records and statues found across the planet seem to indicate that the Black Moon was responsible for the destruction of the planet's civilization, causing so many obliteration events that the remaining survivors went mad from the fear and stress, leading to mass death in the ensuing chaos. The next planet was discovered centuries later, in the year 3499. While this planet could also theoretically support human life, it suffered from frequent volcanic eruptions that rendered much of its surface a flaming mess. However, there were still the dormant ruins of a once advanced civilization of conscious beings. Much like the prior planet, they'd been driven extinct by Black Moon obliteration events a century before the Seek even arrived. Unlike the last planet, however, it seems that they accepted their fate and went gently into the night. The planet was now overrun by billions of armored bat-like creatures that operated on pure instinct, and thus were not considered conscious enough to be obliterated. The final planet was reached in 3764, and was the most fruitful of the 3 discoveries. This planet was hyper-advanced, fully urbanized, and covered in sprawling megacities, with records and technology over 1,000 years ahead of Earth. Before the Black Moon killed almost all of them, there were a species of humanoid telepathic fungi, and had developed an awareness of the Black Moon's existence that was on par with that of humanity's. They even had their own equivalent of the SCP Foundation actively working on countermeasures. And most amazingly of all, Seek found one surviving member of this species on the planet, cryogenically frozen. The craft was immediately instructed to collect the survivor and return home for interrogation. The administrator was preparing for what could be the most important conversation since he met the Hermit all those thousands of years ago. Does the Black Moon howl? Only when waning. When the surviving creature, codenamed Sage, was returned to Earth, the administrator was eager to finally speak with it. Like the rest of its now extinct species, Sage spoke through powerful telepathic mind waves, which only the administrator, thanks to his counterbalance abilities, was able to receive at close range without being harmed. Incidentally, it wasn't long until the very fact of the administrator's nature as a counterbalance came up in the mental conversation. Sage could tell, just by being in his presence. They discovered a number of vital truths over their brief time communicating. That Sage's survival had been pure luck, for starters. The Black Moon is still very much capable of obliterating conscious beings in an unconscious state. The administrator also learned that he was merely the latest in an extremely long line of counterbalances across time, space, and species. Though everyone but him had waived this duty, passed it on. Sage had one question to ask the administrator in turn. What is SCP? The singular conceptual bunker being worked on and perfected for thousands of years by now by the Foundation's top scientists and conceptual engineers. The administrator replied, "Victory, but it will take a very, very long time. Specifically, so long that he would see the stars go out around him, one by one." Shocked, Sage asked him what good victory would do him then. Rather than say it aloud, he replied with a thought. Sage paused and said, "I see. How blasphemous of you. Hopefully it works." After this, the administrator proceeded to the singular conceptual bunker and entered it, leaving instructions for the Foundation to be run by a newly formed O5 Council in his indefinite absence. Thousands of years later, in the year 5011, Sage spoke one more time, repeating the words, hopefully, hopefully, before turning solid black and disappearing. The Black Moon had claimed one more victim, but billions more had gone in the interim. The administrator had no more answers to give. At least, no more answers that anyone but him would understand. He was inside the singular conceptual bunker now, loaded into a device known as Tome, an experimental memorial module meant to pick up and record all the last messages of every dying civilization across the universe when the time finally came. All he could do was wait, and wait was exactly what we did. Does the Black Moon howl? Yes, yes it does. Years pass, too many to count. It's a time after names now, and Tome sits in the very center drinking in the end of the universe. The last of all the human colonies across the universe were obliterated by the Black Moon back in the year 7329. So long ago. But some of the final messages of fear, panic, and distress still echoed around in the administrator's mind.
Hello? Is there anyone here? We require assistance. It's taking people every day. We need help. There's barely anyone left. We need help. Hello? Hello? Cabal 0943, we have abandoned the false flesh. We have abandoned the false flesh. The shepherd's crook broken neath my knee. Cabal 0943, Cabal 0943, forgive us! Forgive us! We're going to leave this on. It's so dark outside now. It's blotted out the sun. I have to go now.
Respond. First convenience. Emergency. Situation developing. Require additional resources.
My fault, your fault, our fault, my fault, your fault, our fault, my fault, your fault, our fault! Rip my brain out now, rip my brain out now!
And a small child, the last on Earth, simply asking, "Hello?" into an indifferent microphone. But the administrator had to wait. As the singular conceptual bunker became the solitary conceptual bunker, he was the last conscious being in the universe, and still he needed to wait as the stars went dark outside. Only when there was nothing outside but black was it finally time for the counterbalance's long game to play off. There was nothing left of our universe. The only thing here was the SCB and the Black Moon itself. With everything else gone, the Black Moon only had one conscious being left to obliterate. It opened the door to the solitary conceptual bunker and stepped inside. This doesn't make sense. How can the Black Moon, an entity beyond our dimension, beyond physical form, take a step? Good question. The same question, incidentally, that was going through the Black Moon's mind as it entered the bunker. It didn't look at all how the entity expected. It was like a bar, a counter, with rows of bottles behind it, a jukebox playing in the corner. A man stood behind the bar cleaning the glasses. The counterbalance. The administrator. He said, "Well, there you are. Certainly took your time. Can I pour you a little something?" This only served to increase the Black Moon's confusion. It had form here. Dark smoke compressed into a vaguely humanoid shape. It could speak. It could think. None of this made any sense. The being that had just wiped out all conscious life and seen the very death of the universe was truly and utterly confused. The administrator just seemed to be enjoying himself, preparing for a confrontation hundreds of billions of years in the making. The singular conceptual bunker, or perhaps the singular containment bunker, was a truly ingenious creation. A place of pure ideas, where everything inside was on the same level. Here there were no immortals, no gods, just ideas on the same level playing field. And it was time for the Black Moon's idea to come to an end. It was a trap, and the entire universe was the bait. Without warning, the administrator pulled up a shotgun from underneath the table and unleashed both barrels into the Black Moon's chest. The creature took the hit and fought back, dragging the administrator to the ground, beating him, strangling him. He could feel the light fading under the monster's relentless assault, until he managed to get his desperate hands on a glass ashtray. He beat the monster over the head with it until its grip loosened, and he was able to slide out. There, the killer of the universe was on the ground before him. He grabbed the monster, held it in place, and beat it to death. He was gravely injured by the battle, but the Black Moon was no more. Here in the singular conceptual bunker, he had won. The administrator, no longer the counterbalance in the absence of the Black Moon, hobbled over to the jukebox, produced a single beautiful coin from his pocket. He pushed the coin into the slot, wheezed a pained breath, and said, "The thing is, this place is only information. There's nothing else out there. Not even matter. The universe closed its doors a long time ago. This place can go from information back to matter with just the press of a button. Let's see what happens when we introduce something to nothing." For a second it looks as though he might fall, but he doesn't. Instead, he slams the button on the jukebox and with a relieved laugh says, "Let there be light." And there was light.
It goes without saying that the SCP Foundation archives are filled with some terrifying monsters. Even the deadliest creatures can, in theory, be defeated, or at least soundly avoided. After all, they're just flesh and blood, or in some cases, metal or concrete. But what if reality as you know it one day just broke? Or worse, you were transported to a reality so frightening and alien to our own that death seemed like the only escape. But you couldn't even give yourself that. This brings us to today's topic, the terrifying alternate reality of SCP-3001. The Foundation is no stranger to freaky alternate dimensions, but what was experienced by Joint Lead Researcher Dr. Robert Scranton at Site-120 is a truly unique nightmare. Co-managed by his wife, Dr. Anna Lang, Site-120 is a facility largely designated for research into SCPs with dangerous reality warping capabilities in order to mitigate future containment breaches. Reality warpers are among some of the more perplexing and dangerous SCPs, from the pocket dimension creating SCP-106 to the SCP creating Dr. Wondertainment and everything in between. Scranton and Lang's goal to further study such entities was an admirable one, if a little overambitious. And on January 2, 2000, during the testing of a new technology created by the Foundation's leading power couple, disaster finally struck. Scranton and Lang had already been the brains behind one of the Foundation's most valuable tools in the fight against reality-bending SCPs, the Scranton Reality Anchors. Their follow-up, the Lang-Scranton Stabilizer, or LSS, likely would have been an even more advanced variant of their earlier invention, and should have been a huge success for the team. But things didn't turn out that way. Dr. Scranton and several other researchers were gathered in Reality Lab A performing routine tests on the LSS prototypes. While other technicians ran diagnostics tests, Scranton stood at the control panel, the blinking red light above the console confirming that everything was going according to plan. But as anyone who's fallen victim to one of the Foundation's many anomalies will tell you, just because you've done everything correctly doesn't mean you're safe. Scranton began operating the machine, not knowing that something was rumbling up towards him from below. Without warning, a sudden, unexpected burst of seismic activity rocked the entire base. Researchers grabbed onto whatever was closest as the world shook around them. In his panic, Dr. Scranton clung to the LSS control panel as the seismic blast fried the circuits and kicked it into overdrive. There was a blast of magnificent blinding light, and when the rumbling stopped, not only was the doctor gone, he had been erased from reality as we know it. The earthquake had caused a deadly malfunction in the machine meant to stabilize reality, and instead tore a rift in it, dragging the unfortunate doctor and the control panel into oblivion. His wife, Dr. Lang, and the many researchers who idolized him were devastated by his unexpected demise at the hand of what should have been his crowning achievement. The one silver lining was that this reality-ripping event had almost definitely eliminated the doctor quickly and painlessly. As far as the Foundation and his loved ones were concerned, Scranton's death had been immediate and complete, a luxury afforded to few Foundation employees who die anomalous deaths. But sadly, that isn't how Dr. Scranton's story, or the story of SCP-3001, ends. No, this is where it all begins. How do we know all this? In the hellish new place where Scranton had been transported, the control panel from the LSS that he'd been clinging to for dear life had been transported with him, and continued to record audio data from this anomalous location. Not that Dr. Scranton realized it, not at first anyway. As far as he knew, he'd suddenly been transported into a pitch-black location. No sights, no sounds, no sense. True nothingness. At first, the doctor was confused. One second he was testing out his new technology, and the next he was quite literally nowhere. In spite of his current situation, the doctor was still an intelligent and rational man. He took a moment to compose himself, hoping that in time his eyes would adjust to the new darkness around him. But that moment never came. The darkness remained perfectly absolute. Much like the darkness in another reality-defying SCP, the deadly endless staircase known as SCP-087, the dark seemed thick, almost like you could touch it. The doctor, not wanting to give himself to despair and die in this impossible place, and with no other options seemingly available, began walking. Either he'd find his way out, or the Foundation would find him. No need to panic. It may have altered the doctor's temperament if he knew that the Foundation already assumed he was dead, and that no search party was going to come looking for him. Still, logic dictates that if a person walks for long enough, they're bound to find something. The problem Scranton was about to face was that SCP-3001 doesn't run by any kind of conventional logic. He walked and walked and walked, but he didn't seem to get any nearer to or farther from anything. But how could he even know? After all, in total darkness, there aren't any landmarks to assist in navigation. The doctor walked and paced and screamed for days on end, but he made no progress. He was alone in an empty world. He had no choice though, so he kept walking and walking and walking for 11 days. During that time, he felt his hunger and thirst grow. He was in terrible pain from a mix of starvation and dehydration, but the release of death didn't seem to come for him. He was going to have to learn the rules of this new place the hard way, and it grimly dawned on Dr. Scranton that dying in this place might not even be the worst possible outcome. He paced and repeated facts to himself, hoping to ground himself in the moment and avoid the panic that could so easily set in. Name, Robert Scranton. Age, 39. Birthday, September 19th, 1961. Favorite color, blue. Favorite song, Living on a Prayer. Wife, Anna. Little by little, the words seemed to turn to nonsense in his mouth as the terror grew. Just as he felt like he was about to lose his mind, he noticed something. A small oasis in the endless darkness of SCP-3001. The glowing red light on the LSS control panel. Where had it come from? And how was it still recording? The doctor had no idea, but he was grateful for any kind of familiarity in this strange darkness around him. Perhaps the LSS could be the key to saving him, or at least figuring out what on earth was going on here. Whatever the case, there was no denying that having the panel here was better than nothing. At least, when it was found, if it was ever found, then people would know what had happened to him. As the days passed and he continued to mysteriously survive, Dr. Scranton deduced that one didn't need food or water to survive continually in SCP-3001. The location had an anomalous effect on its inhabitants. As the days passed and turned to weeks of wandering in the darkness, Dr. Scranton further deduced that he was no longer in his home dimension. This was an entirely separate pocket dimension, much like the one possessed by SCP-106, but featureless, a perfect self-contained void. Now dimly illuminated by the red light of the panel, Dr. Scranton explored further into the void around him. He traveled for months on end, the pain of his deficiencies growing by the day, but found he was getting nowhere. All things considered, he wasn't even sure he was moving, or whether reality and darkness were swirling around him like a thick liquid. Rather than walking on a single flat surface, he was moving in all directions across a three-dimensional plane. The space-time continuum appeared to be entirely broken here, where movement is more defined by the conscious intention to move than any real geographical repositioning. Dr. Scranton knew that this place broke every single one of Kijel's laws of reality parameters. And from his years working with a plethora of reality warpers in Site-120, he had a theory for why this pocket dimension was so strange. It had an extraordinarily weak Hume field. Before we get back to Dr. Scranton's semi-living nightmare, we need a quick primer on Hume theory and why having a weak Hume field is such a problem. A Hume is a unit of measurement for the strength and amount of reality in a given location or being. In an area with an incredibly low Hume field relative to our world, such as SCP-3001, universe breaches and anomalous incidents rise significantly. At the time of his being trapped there, SCP-3001 had the lowest number of Humes in any recorded environment, making it a phenomenally anomalous zone. It was for this reason that starvation and dehydration never took hold of him despite causing him great pain. And the worst by far was yet to come. Dr. Scranton wasn't trapped in this dimension for weeks or even months. He was trapped in the darkness for years, and it took a nightmarish toll on his body and mind.
The small, flashing red light on his LSS control panel became his only friend, and as the years drew on, he would hold entire conversations with his only source of illumination. He knew that his days were numbered. If he didn't escape the dimension within around 3 years, the Hume field would diffuse further, and he would be left in a truly horrific state. But based on how little headway he'd made in the time he'd been there, he didn't feel optimistic. He kept speaking into the recorder, if only to break the silence and prevent him from going completely insane. But even that would only hold it off for so long. Alone and talking to himself endlessly in the darkness, Dr. Scranton could feel his mind slipping as the confines of the pocket dimension constricted and his body began to change. The low Hume field slowly diffused his physical matter, destroying the physical integrity of his body, but never being merciful enough to actually let him die. In his haunting audio logs, the doctor described his hands as diffusing and thinning out like spiderwebs. Over time, there was less and less of him, and what was left wasn't entirely human. As Scranton's Hume level lowered to equalize with that of SCP-3001, the lines between his body and the LSS control console began to blur in a twisted marriage of warped flesh and machine. The Lang-Scranton stabilizer was anything but stable. Before his mind and body became something else entirely, the doctor still had the presence of mind to finally realize how he'd come to be in this terrible place. The LSS had opened a wormhole known as a Class C broken entry into a paradoxical pocket dimension between layers of reality and taken him through it. He'd slipped through a crack in reality into absolute darkness, and now he was stuck with a fate far worse than death. How do we know any of this? Much like the event in the first place, it's a total accident. Testing superior reality-bending technology almost 6 years after the disappearance caused the sudden return of the missing LSS to Site-120's reality labs. The only trace of Dr. Scranton that it brought back with it was the blood and viscera that coated the console, much to the abject horror of his still-grieving wife, Dr. Anna Lang. To this day, Dr. Scranton, formerly one of the Foundation's brightest minds, remains trapped in the nightmare of SCP-3001. His current condition, whether the Doctor is still alive after 20 years of being warped by the low Hume field of 3001's darkened confines, is still unknown. But for the Doctor's own sake, we hope he's been dead for quite some time, because few things on Earth are as horrifying as the alternative. On an ordinary day in 1991, a young man known by the initials JS went on a hike with 4 of his friends on the wooded outskirts of their small town. Everything seemed perfectly normal until JS began to feel a strange sense of familiarity, like he had been in this spot before. He couldn't shake this weird feeling, but thought nothing more of it. Little did he know that this was a sign of deadly things to come. Several hours after first experiencing that sense of deja vu, JS was found by the side of the road, covered in cuts and scratches, with his friends nowhere to be found. This is the story of SCP-939, an unforgettable monster that you'll never remember. There was no way for JS to know that the unsettling feeling he felt and the horrors that followed it were the result of an experiment conducted by the SCP Foundation, an experiment with deadly, unforeseen consequences. JS and his friends were exposed to a substance known only as AMN-C227 as part of a series of tests performed by the SCP Foundation, intended to determine the effectiveness of this substance as a deliberate amnestic. Dealing with as many mysterious, secret creatures and objects as they do, the SCP Foundation has long needed a way to tamper with the memories of those exposed to the Foundation's various prisoners and test subjects. And when the Foundation discovered AMN-C227, it seemed like it might be perfect for this purpose. So where did AMN-C227 come from? Over a year before the incident with JS and his friends, the SCP Foundation captured SCP-939. SCP-939 is a species of endothermic predators that live and hunt in packs. They are designated Keter class and regarded as highly dangerous and hostile to human life. Native to caves, they have no eyes, translucent red skin, and stand at an average of 2.2 meters tall, with an average weight of 250 kilograms. They have 4 limbs, each ending in 3-fingered claws and a 4th opposable digit resembling a thumb. In addition to their sharp claws, their mouths are filled with red fang-like teeth that reach up to 6 centimeters in length. In place of their absent eyes, they have light-sensitive spots running along their backs, which are covered in spines believed to detect changes in air pressure and flow. In addition to their many other terrifying attributes,
The internal anatomy of SCP-939 poses a biological mystery. These creatures have no circulatory system and no digestive tract. That's right, in spite of being predators seemingly acting on a need to feed, they have no stomach. Instead, when they eat, their food builds up in their respiratory system until its presence inhibits function, and then it is regurgitated. In spite of being a creature that should not, under any logical conditions, be able to live, SCP-939 continues to persist, and is even capable of giving birth to live young after a gestation period of 12 months. The SCP Foundation was able to study a litter of these young that were born in captivity in September of 1992, though the creatures remain just as much of a scientific mystery as they were upon first discovery. Everything about them seems to defy the logic of the natural world, which, to be fair, is really nothing new for the Foundation. The respiratory system of SCP-939 was found to exhale small traces of an airborne amnestic substance, given the name AMN-C227. This compound blocks the formation of memories for the duration of exposure to it, plus a 30-minute period following the exposure, give or take a few minutes. It is colorless, odorless, tasteless, and completely undetectable in the bloodstream after only 60 minutes. AMN-C227 was approved for use as a Class C amnestic by the SCP Foundation in 1990, following some initial tests. However, after one particular incident involving a young man and his friends, the official use of AMN-C227 was suspended. JS and 3 of his 4 friends were previously given a dose of AMN-C227, though the details of why they were given the amnestic has since been stricken from the record. Several months after being exposed to AMN-C227, JS and his friends went out on their ill-fated hiking trip. While hiking, JS was suddenly overcome with a sense of déjà vu. When he mentioned it to his friends, 3 of them agreed that they had felt it too. One of the group, another young man who had not been exposed to AMN-C227, was uncomfortable and decided to go home. JS and the remaining 3 members of the group made the choice to stay in the woods and try to determine what was triggering the unusual feeling of familiarity. As they got closer and closer to a large cave near the hiking trail, the sense of having been there before grew stronger and stronger. Armed with only one flashlight and a foolish curiosity, the 4 went inside the cave. They made their way deeper and deeper and deeper into the darkness, not knowing why they felt this way or what they might find inside. None of the group could explain just what felt so familiar, only that the further they made their way into the cave, the more pronounced the feeling became. It was getting late, and they knew they should have been afraid to venture so deep into a cave with only one light source and no knowledge of what lay inside. But still, they pressed on. One of the group remarked that they should turn back, but the others refused to listen. They wanted to know what they were getting close to, what was drawing them deeper and deeper into the cave. Unfortunately for them, they would get their answer. In the heart of the cave was a pack of SCP-939, waiting patiently for their prey to wander into their domain. There are no witnesses to account for what exactly happened to JS and his companions, but we can reasonably piece the events together from what happened after. Once the friends reached the heart of the cave, the creatures were on them in seconds, raking them with their sharp claws and biting with their fangs. SCP-939 are larger and stronger than most people, so it was probably not much of a fight. However, while his friends were being devoured, JS was somehow able to scramble out of the cave and make his way into the woods in search of help. Under the influence of the AMN-C227 that had built up in the cave from the presence of the pack of SCP-939, JS lost a large portion of his memory of the event. He found himself on the side of the highway late at night, seriously injured and his clothes ripped. An officer found him there and asked him to stay still and remain calm until an ambulance could arrive. JS was still in a panic and attempted to run away from the officer, begging to be released so that he could get away. He babbled incoherently about the color red, screaming over and over again about the red, though when prompted, he could not explain what the red he was screaming about referred to. His friends were not with him. Just as the officer managed to calm JS, the ambulance arrived. Its flashing red lights sent him into another frenzy, and he attempted to escape custody, claiming that the red lights were going to get him. The official police report described JS as perhaps being under the influence of a powerful hallucinogen, that he was just having a bad trip, but the SCP Foundation knew better. The Foundation conducted an interview with JS about his experience, and determined that SCP-939 was certainly involved. As part of their cover-up effort, they strongly implicated JS in the disappearance and the death of his friends. He was convicted of manslaughter, though the bodies of his friends were never found.
It is rumored that the SCP Foundation hired him on a prison work release program, and that he now works as a member of the janitorial staff at one of the Foundation's facilities. This incident led to the suspension of the use of AMN C227, as it revealed some vital and disturbing information about the compound's side effects. After the exposure to AMN C227, a person who found themselves exposed to it again would experience a sense of familiarity and felt compelled to investigate the source of this feeling. Essentially, anyone treated with AMN C227 are not made aware of the existence and danger of SCP-939 would become a perfect victim, primed to be attracted to dens of SCP-939. It is likely that this side effect is not a coincidence, but rather a deliberate hunting tactic designed to attract prey that had somehow managed to escape. With no memory of their attack at the hands of SCP-939, this previous intended prey would find themselves drawn to the same den or even a new one, not knowing that they were walking back into near certain death. While the SCP Foundation suspended the use of AMN C227 as a Class C amnestic, they did recruit a team of SCP field operatives to take advantage of this side effect. This team of operatives were deliberately administered a dose of AMN C227 and briefed on its effects, as well as the dangers of following the feeling of déjà vu should it surface in the field. These infected officers were essentially used as bloodhounds, relying on any sense of unusual familiarity to sniff out new dens of SCP-939 so they could be captured and contained by the Foundation. As far as we know, this operation is still ongoing today. However, now that the Foundation has a sufficient number of specimens to study, additional dens of SCP-939 that are discovered are ordered to be immediately destroyed. As for the SCP-939 still in captivity, they are contained in environmentally regulated and negatively pressured cells with walls of reinforced concrete. The doors to the cells are airtight to prevent the leakage of any AMN C227. And any personnel that interact with one of the creatures is required to wear level C hazmat gear to avoid exposure and follow decontamination procedures upon exiting the cell. All SCP-939 have subdermal tracking devices implanted to find them in the event of escape. Only one SCP-939 has given birth in the time that the creatures have been in captivity. Strangely, SCP-939 young look indistinguishable from human infants and change their physical appearance at some yet unknown point as they age. If any more offspring are produced, they will immediately be separated from the parent and studied. All that we know is that they are found in caves in the woods outside of a small town. It could be any town, even yours. So, if you're ever out hiking and struck with a sudden feeling of déjà vu, don't investigate. Don't get curious. Just go home. It might just save your life. Ask yourself a simple question. Is the world around you real? It seems like the answer should be pretty obvious. Of course the world as you know it is real. How else would you be able to interact with it? Perhaps a better question would be this. How much do you trust that the world you know is real? How much do you believe that reality, as you experience it, is constant and cannot be changed by external forces? Now imagine, if you can, an entity to which the very fabric of reality is like clay, able to be shaped and molded at will. Then imagine that this entity, this malicious, twisted, and unknowable horror, has taken a special interest in you. If you can picture such a scenario, then you may as well be standing in the shoes of James Talleyrand, a Foundation researcher assigned to SCP-3099. Talleyrand could only have imagined what the Foundation kept contained in an airtight cell all the way at the bottom of a kilometer-long shaft, and never expected that this was where his lifeless body would be found. Despite having the entity contained, the Foundation's only knowledge of SCP-3099 came from a text document discovered on Talleyrand's phone after his demise. Even their own records indicated that no such creature ever existed. Why? What could possibly shape reality in such a way that it could hide its own existence from the Foundation? And where was it now? The document on Talleyrand's phone yielded some evidence, seeming to be a long, rambling, and confused account of some sort of battle between a reality-shaping entity and the ill-fated researcher sent to examine it. Unlike many of the Foundation's documents, The entry for SCP-3099 is riddled with contradictions and strike-throughs, a confusing mess of information that makes piecing together the mysteries of Talaran's fate all the more difficult. Beneath the strange formatting and uncertainty surrounding SCP-3099 lies the tale of one man's torture for the amusement of an impossibly powerful and eternally sadistic creature. Based on the information available, it appears that SCP-3099 was fixated on Talaran. Upon his arrival to the entity's cell, the researcher had no idea how long he would spend in the company of SCP-3099, or that he would never emerge alive. Many SCPs contained by the Foundation require their own specially made prisons in order to hold them and maintain the safety of Foundation staff as well as the outside world. But imagine if an SCP could turn the tables, bending the world around a single member of the Foundation, using all of reality as their own personalized torture chamber. The list of horrors endured by Talaran is both exhaustive and incomplete, given the length of time he spent with the creature. Shortly after James Talaran was assigned to Site-118, where SCP-3099 was contained, the entity was somehow able to breach containment and began to twist the world around it in the name of a singular, cruel objective: the torture of James Talaran. The creature, while having no physical description, possessed the capability to cause either a CK-class reality restructuring event or a ZK-class end-of-reality event. SCP-3099 was somehow able to both destroy reality itself while simultaneously rebuilding it around its prisoner, researcher Talaran. Every creature, person, and machination that SCP-3099 created was done so with the express intention of making Talaran suffer horribly over the course of millions of years, according to the researcher's own writings. The exact details of how SCP-3099 tortured Talaran are littered throughout the document he was found with, but it is apparent that the entity was able to use its reality-altering abilities to continually revive the man after killing him as a way to prolong his pain. SCP-3099 seemed to be able to use its powers however it pleased, but focused all its attention and actions on causing misery for one man. It simply enjoyed inflicting suffering. One of the examples of the atrocities James Talaran suffered at the mercy of a cold, remorseless creature was witnessing the deaths of others. Although they were constructed and controlled by SCP-3099, Talaran saw trained Foundation security personnel drag 3 people into the cell. He recognized them instantly as his own family. Talaran was made to watch as his mother, father, and sister were executed with a single gunshot to the head by members of the same organization that he was a part of. All of Talaran's professional colleagues were also killed in front of him, followed by anyone and everyone that had come into contact with James Talaran, including the O5 Council. He was made to watch as they were systematically murdered one by one, all for the enjoyment of SCP-3099. At some point during the creature's torture of Talaran, there appears to have been some attempt to contain SCP-3099 within another SCP, SCP-2432, a room within a hotel now owned by the Foundation that appears to compel its guests to write exaggerated positive reviews after staying there. When introduced to SCP-2432, SCP-3099's ability to alter reality seemed to have the effect of creating a dimensional anomaly within the hotel. A crawlspace opened up in SCP-2432, leading to an almost identical room. The front door of this new room, designated SCP-2432-1, led to an alternate dimension that resembled the hotel housing SCP-2432. The rooms of this new version of the SCP-2432 hotel were a seemingly infinite, endless loop of rooms. This dimension also played host to a number of strange creatures, as uncovered by Foundation research teams that ventured there. Most notably, a creature resembling a male Homo sapien, calling itself Researcher Talaran. This being was dressed in clothing similar to Foundation researchers and appeared nervous and confused when approached by personnel, only to be executed when asked to be told the location of SCP-3099. Later during SCP-3099's 3 million year torture session, James Talaran was interviewed with another doctor working for the Foundation. The interviewing doctor had no recollection of Talaran's assignment to SCP-3099. and both James's involvement with the Foundation and the very existence of SCP-3099 were expunged from the Foundation's database. As Talleyrand desperately tried to rationalize what was happening to him, he told the interviewer, "I have trouble focusing on things now. I just feel a lot of unease. It's like reality has started to feel less real, if that makes sense." Shortly after, he attempted to ask the doctor for his name and for him to identify which of the Foundation sites they were at. In response, the doctor emitted a strange noise from his mouth, confusing Talleyrand. "That's not a name. You just made a noise with your mouth," the researcher replied. "Why am I thinking of redactions? How can a word be redacted like that in a normal conversation?" Following this, the floor beneath James Talleyrand's feet disappeared, and he was swallowed by darkness, as SCP-3099 continued bending reality to make him suffer. What followed were multiple failed attempts from Talleyrand to either escape from the entity or nullify its abilities to warp reality. SCP-3099 had, at a later point, trapped Talleyrand in a stage play version of itself. As James frantically tried to escape out of a nearby door, where he hoped to find reality, he was met with a solid wall. "I'm trapped in whatever this place is with this thing, and there's no outside reality anymore," he realized. Researcher Talleyrand tried to understand the entity, but SCP-3099 defied description. It was simply chaos. In his desperation, Talleyrand was able to dig a tiny hole in the floor through which he could see a light. Filled with thoughts of his beloved family, his colleagues, and the rest of the world that had once existed, he opened the hole wider. It is unclear what happened after this, but it is apparent that James Talleyrand was still unable to escape SCP-3099. However, as the situations he found himself in grew increasingly strange, James Talleyrand was able to take greater control of his predicament. This is evidenced in the Foundation's document regarding SCP-3099. Researcher Talleyrand cannot be contained by this. Researcher Talleyrand will fight his way back. Researcher Talleyrand will recontain SCP-3099. This torture had gone on long enough, and researcher James Talleyrand was determined to be free of the creature that had taken such sick pleasure in his pain. Talleyrand at one point was able to subdue SCP-3099, although it is initially unclear how he accomplished this. There were several attempts made to contain the entity, using a recursive joke, a melon, the graves of American crime novelist Robert B. Parker, or an O5 council member, and a roach motel. It is believed that every single one of these attempts failed. Attempting to beat the creature at its own game, Talleyrand tried to turn SCP-3099's reality-altering powers against it by imagining the entity as something easier to subdue. These included several moldy blankets, a murderous penguin, and a pillow. Eventually, Talleyrand was able to contain SCP-3099 with the aid of 48 trained containment personnel, all of whom were also researcher Talleyrand. During this time, a conversation between the two were partially recorded, although any dialogue from SCP-3099 suffered from data corruption. Claiming to finally be in charge and in control of the situation, Talleyrand interrogated SCP-3099, berating the creature for keeping him prisoner. "You can't frighten me anymore. For the first million years of nonsensical containment procedures and tortures and dream logic, it was the worst pain I had ever felt, but I survived. For the second million years, it was still the hardest thing I had ever done, but I survived. By the third million years, I was growing numb." The researcher tried to ascertain the exact nature and origin of SCP-3099, but to no avail. Vowing to fight the entity, Talleyrand told it, "Here's the thing about horror and weirdness. The more you reveal of it, the less effect it has. I am sick of your horror. I am sick of you." Afterwards, he was melted into goo for 5 years. It appears that shortly after this, researcher Talleyrand managed to understand how to destroy SCP-3099. While the entity was immortal and virtually unstoppable, he realized its weakness, that it had to bond to another being in order to survive. Upon discovering this, Talleyrand took his own life, causing all that SCP-3099 had done to disappear. After Foundation researcher James Talleyrand committed suicide, reality reverted to its original state, before SCP-3099 had heavily altered it. His death freeing reality from the evil entity once and for all. The Foundation remains unaware of what SCP-3099 was, or indeed is, and one can only guess as to why the entity subjugated Tolerant to such terror and horror. What made this powerful reality bender hold such a perverse fixation on one man? Some have likened the creature to a horror writer, continually subjugating a character to all manner of nightmares before deciding to redraft and try something new. Whatever it was, SCP-3099 carries with it a warning that reality isn't always as it seems. The fabric of our world is littered with strange doorways if you know where to look for them. Tears, portals, anomalies, all leading to places and planes beyond human imagining and understanding. And SCP-2317, otherwise known as a door to another world, certainly fits that description. Contained and kept at all times under the watch of armed guards, SCP-2317 appears to be a simple and unsuspecting wooden door in its frame. It hardly looks like it requires such extreme round-the-clock security, or needs a strange, secretive ritual that the Foundation performs, presumably to keep the door closed. But of course, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed doorway isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. Even by the Foundation's already high standards, the requirements and regulations for personnel who are assigned to SCP-2317 seem oddly specific. Psychological testing is standard practice to work for the Foundation, but an additional hurdle that anyone has to clear before even getting to glimpse at this unassuming wooden door is having a score of at least 72 on the Milgram Obedience Examination. It is also mandatory that personnel assigned to maintaining it are both unmarried, with no children or next of kin, as well as an unwavering, unquestioning loyalty to the Foundation, pure devotion to its code and objectives. These may seem like strange requirements. After all, SCP-2317 is just a door, isn't it? Perhaps there's a reason that the Foundation keeps so much of the information about SCP-2317 buried deep under layers upon layers of security, with only the Overseer Council privy to the full details of its strange nature. Knowledge, as they say, is power. But maybe knowing too much about whatever is behind that door can prove deadly. Still, if SCP-2317 is a door to another world, an alternate dimension, or parallel reality, it must be safe enough to visit. After all, the Foundation has been sending personnel in there on a regular basis. Daily, in fact. According to the O5 Council, this is done as part of a procedure to maintain active containment of something lurking beyond that old wooden doorframe. But what could possibly warrant such constant maintenance and surveillance? In accordance with the Foundation's guidelines, all staff are required to rotate out of observing SCP-2317 after every 2 months, and spend the following 3rd month in full psychological counseling, before they are permitted to return to the containment unit housing the door to another world. It was after one of these month-long periods of evaluation that a Foundation guard was informed that his security clearance has been raised to level 3, and that he'd been selected for the duty of carrying out 220 Calabasas. He knew the name instantly. This was the title given to the daily containment procedure that absolutely had to be carried out. The guard didn't question these orders. After all, he'd been selected precisely because of his loyalty to the Foundation. He did make one request to his commanding officer, however. He wanted to know what had happened to the last guard that had performed the procedure. "Didn't make it out of psychological evaluation," the officer replied. Not letting this affect his dedication, the guard was told to prepare for Procedure 220 Calabasas. Along with a fellow member of Foundation security personnel, the guard was instructed to gather everything on a strange list. The first was a pre-selected member of Class D personnel, specifically a convicted murderer. Class D refers to disposable class personnel, expendable individuals recruited by the Foundation for the sole purpose of testing SCPs. Class Ds were usually prison inmates repurposed for SCP testing, and the one chosen for 220 Calabasas was no exception, serving multiple life sentences for murders, or at least that's what the guard had been told. A Foundation personnel member instructed him to refer to the Class Ds solely as the assistant from that point on. Next, the guard collected a live chicken, an obsidian-edged knife, a silver aspergillum and aspersorium, to be filled with 500 cc's of holy water, that have been blessed by a priest of the Abrahamic faith, and finally, a 1-kiloton nuclear device, which according to instructions was only to be detonated in the unlikely event of a catastrophic containment failure. In other words, the last resort. After following his instructions to the letter and without question, the guard and his colleague were briefed. The Foundation personnel member informed them that he'd be joining and leading them in the procedure. The staff member also specified that henceforth he'd be referred to as the Celebrant until the completion of 220 Calabasas. The guard was acutely aware of how specific these instructions were, but trusted in the Foundation, knowing that if they wanted this procedure performed a certain way, then it was in everyone's best interest to carry out the orders to the letter. But what the Celebrant then went on to explain raised far more questions about SCP-3017 and the nature of Procedure 220 Calabasas. The Class D joining them wasn't actually a Class D. The assistant, as they were now referred to, was in reality another Foundation staff member, with a Level 4 security clearance specifically tailored to SCP-2317. Every member of staff entering through SCP-2317 and taking an active role in 22 Calabasas needed to be informed that this assistant was not to be harmed or treated as a member of disposable class. Fighting back the nagging question of why the Foundation would employ this subterfuge, the guard, along with his fellow security officer, the Celebrant, and assistant, prepared for their departure through the door to another world at solar noon, when the sun was highest over SCP-2317. Solar noon, chickens, and holy water. This all seemed like an oddly occult combination for the Foundation. As they entered the old wooden door, beyond lay a barren salt plain, stretching out for kilometers in every direction. This alternate dimension, according to the briefing, was designated SCP-2317 Prime. The guard immediately noticed a ring of 7 pillars directly ahead of the group as they entered, each of them bearing intricately detailed engravings unlike anything from any era of ancient history. Procedure 220 Calabasas was carried out quickly but carefully, the guard watching as the Celebrant and assistant were careful not to miss a step. First, the Celebrant scattered holy water into the center of the pillars with the aspergillum and aspersorium, looking down at his feet and keeping a steady pace as he stepped counterclockwise around them. The guard watched intently as the Celebrant completed his circuit around the pillars and turned to the assistant, anointing his head with holy water. 7 seals, 7 rings, 7 thrones for the Scarlet King, he said aloud. The assistant, with the obsidian blade in his hand, took the chicken and dispatched it in sacrifice, letting its blood mix with the holy water. He then repeated the Celebrant's circuit in the opposite direction before stepping into the center of the stone pillars. Blood for the old gods, water for the new king, the assistant recited, pouring the remaining mix of blood and holy water over a patch of salt in the middle of the 7 pillars. Even though he knew it wasn't his place to question the Foundation, as the 220 Calabasas procedure took place, the guard couldn't help but wonder what all this was for. It seems so ritualistic, like something deeply religious or even magical. He never bought into all that occult mumbo-jumbo, even while working for the Foundation. But he had learned not to question anything, even the strangest and most inexplicable of sights. Little did he know that beneath his feet was an ancient and unknowable horror, a beast chained and lying in wait. Contained in a chamber directly underneath the pillars sat an impossibly large creature. Humanoid and obese, its body covered entirely in scales thicker than armor plating. Branch-like horns protruded from its jawless head, pointing up to chains that hung from the 7 pillars above, each one hooked into the entity's back. All but one of the chains was broken, a final withering shackle keeping the Devourer of Worlds in its underground prison. Ever since 1894 BCE, when Erexian mystics imprisoned it, the Devourer has been waiting patiently for its inevitable freedom. It knows, as well as the Foundation, that nothing can be done to prevent the final chain from one day breaking. Even Procedure 220 Calabasas won't keep the creature contained. It's nothing more than a smokescreen, an act designed to create an illusion of active containment and maintain Foundation morale until a permanent solution can be devised to keep SCP-3017 imprisoned. Of course, if the guard had known this, it would have also explained the need for a 1-kiloton nuclear device as part of this staged ritual. Procedure 220 Calabasas had all the components to trick everyone below the O5 Council, emulating religious and occult rituals, the increased level of security surrounding the procedure and its purpose, and telling staff that any failure to correctly and completely perform the 220 Calabasas procedure will result in an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. All these elements work together to conceal the truth that one day the Devourer will escape and lay waste to our dimension. Knowledge is power, and maybe knowing too much truly is deadly. Perhaps if the guard had learned any of this, he'd have understood why his predecessor never made it out of psychological evaluation. Maybe if he had questioned the purpose of Procedure 220 Calabasas, he'd have learned the true nature of SCP-2317 and what that doorway kept out. But he was loyal to the Foundation through and through. As the team finished performing 220 Calabasas and returned through the wooden door, the guard took one last glance over his shoulder at the vast salt plain. The entire dimension was calm, silent, but not peaceful. It was patient. The entity had waited centuries for its time, and now all it would take was the breaking of this seventh and final chain. One day. The door was closed behind the guard as he, the celebrant, the assistant, and his fellow security officers stepped back through. Their work done and, as far as they knew, preventing catastrophe for another day. Only the Foundation higher-ups, the Overseer Council, are aware of the true danger posed by SCP-2317 and its sole inhabitant. Current predictions are that at some point within the next 30 years, the Devourer of Worlds will be freed. Any and all attempts to repair or recreate the chains holding it in place have so far failed. As such, the O5 Council has elected to continue providing Foundation personnel with the ignorant hope that Procedure 220 Calabasas is an effective strategy for containment. As we've said, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed door isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. In the case of SCP-2317, the unassuming wooden door holds at bay an ancient creature of untold power that will one day break free and wreak havoc in our dimension. Nothing the Foundation does can prevent it, or keep it contained behind the door to another world. And only the Overseer Council knows that any and all efforts to do so are futile. With all that in mind, we can only hope that the doorway of SCP-2317 stays closed, at least for a little while longer. It's a natural instinct in many species to protect their young, and sometimes it's not just their own babies, but any young that look like them. Regardless of your personal feelings on humans' earliest stage, it is a scientific fact that human babies are designed to emphasize their own adorable helplessness to make sure that other older humans take care of them. A baby's cry is an inherently distressing sound, and when we hear it, some deep primal part of us feels the urge to comfort and care for the child until the sound stops. But of course, we're talking about the world of the SCP Foundation here, where there are bunnies that can eat anything, teddy bears that might steal your organs to make duplicates of themselves, and chocolate fountains filled with trillions of murderous insects. Nothing is what it seems here, and even the most innocent and cute creatures may be hiding a deadly secret, SCP-734 being no exception. Today we're talking about the baby. This anomaly proves that dangerous things can come in small packages, but where others only saw misery and death, the SCP Foundation saw a certain potential. Our story begins in the maternity ward of a hospital in the USA, where every medical professional's worst nightmare was unfolding. An unknown but incredibly fast-acting, flesh-eating pathogen seemed to be running rampant across the hospital's population. It began when patients who weren't even admitted for dermatological issues started complaining of severe itches and extreme skin pain. Some nurses and doctors in the maternity ward began to experience similar symptoms, as well as one of the infants, leading to a massive quarantine effort. While the initial symptoms first appeared to be limited to severe pain and discomfort on isolated parts of the skin, the condition of the afflicted soon escalated. Their skin began to messily flake off as the cells comprising it lost physical cohesion and died. It was a kind of strange, anomalous rot that seemed to work inwards, first destroying the integrity of the outer layer of skin, and then cause further disintegration to deeper parts of the body. Once the skin had shut off, the pathogen would turn its attention to what was lying beneath. Against all odds, the disease affected organs, muscle tissue, the vascular system, and even bones. Nothing was spared. The victims' bodies would completely break down, and they would be dead within a few hours. By the time the pathogen had finished ravaging its victims, what was left didn't even look human anymore. Not only patients, but doctors and nurses that had been walking the wards mere hours before were now little more than piles of human tissue sitting in what had previously been their hospital beds. Whatever this was, it seemed like the fastest progressing infection in recorded history. Hospital staff and administrators were terrified. This appeared to be an entirely new disease, with a mysterious form of transmission and, worst of all, no cure. They were even more confused when several black vans pulled up outside the hospital, and mysterious men in hazmat suits spilled out and began setting up a quarantine zone around the entire building. Whoever these strange people were, they definitely weren't the CDC. Little did the hospital personnel know that this was the group you'd never want showing up and putting your location on lockdown. It was the SCP Foundation. The infected remains of the victims were taken away for research purposes, and the Foundation operatives immediately began conducting debriefing interviews with witnesses. They soon determined from a mix of eyewitness accounts and hospital surveillance footage that everyone infected with the mysterious pathogen had all been in a particular section of the maternity ward earlier in the day. And when the operatives investigated this area, they found another strange detail. An infant had no registered mother present in the hospital. The Foundation would later learn that this was likely because the baby's mother was the first victim of the deadly disease. After eliminating all other possible options, it seemed that the only anomalous element that could have caused all of this was the mysterious baby. Though just how the mother even survived carrying the baby to term was a mystery in and of itself. The baby was a Caucasian male human infant between 7 and 8 months of age. Nothing appeared outwardly anomalous about the child, but they could confirm that every single victim of the anomalous pathogen had come into physical contact with the child earlier that day. Everyone who had been at the hospital was given amnestic treatment, and the Foundation constructed plausible cover stories for the deaths that had occurred that day. Like so many others before it, the child was secured and spirited away to the nearest applicable Foundation containment site. There it was reclassified SCP-3000, and finally the real testing into what precisely this infant was capable of could begin. Physiologically, SCP-3000 appeared mostly non-anomalous. The infant had above-average intelligence and physical aptitude for a child his age, but otherwise showed no mutations or abnormalities that would suggest a divergence from typical human biology. Despite a vast array of tests performed by the Foundation into essentially every aspect of 734's biology, they couldn't find anything that hinted at the origin of the mysterious pathogen. But through some trial and extremely costly error, the Foundation was able to learn more about how exactly the pathogen worked. The only vector for transmission seemed to be direct contact with the baby itself, up to and including the fluids and residues it leaves behind. Those affected cannot transmit the anomalous flaking effect to others, meaning the risk of an epidemic is relievingly minimal. But of course, accidents still happen, as was discovered when one agent misplaced her sympathy for the baby and decided to remove her mask while interacting with him. Her logic was that her masked face might have caused the baby some kind of distress, and as long as she was only coming into contact with him via her own gloved hands, everything would be fine. But some dust particles were floating in the air at the time, and SCP-734 sneezed in her face. The agent began screaming in pain and recoiling from the baby, but it was already too late. Her fate was sealed. She was taken to the infirmary and given sedatives so that she could hopefully die in as little pain as possible. In roughly 72% of cases, amputation of the affected areas has prevented the entire body from succumbing to the anomalous effects of SCP-734. But this isn't exactly feasible, where the point of contact is the victim's head. Within hours, the agent's flesh had flaked off her face, leaving her looking like a red, bloody skull. A few hours after that, she didn't have a head at all. Throughout the disintegration process of this unfortunate agent, the Foundation took grisly photographs. These photographs are shown to anyone preparing to work on the SCP-734 research project, to teach them a hard lesson on the importance of adhering to proper safety protocols. And these protocols about how to deal with the baby are incredibly tight, given that even incidental contact is often a death sentence. Anyone entering the baby's containment chamber needs to wear contained atmosphere hazmat suits. Anyone who makes physical contact with the baby, even when suited up, is immediately removed from the area and subject to several hours of quarantine and observation. Even inanimate objects that have been inside the containment chamber need to be thoroughly sterilized before being removed. Given that even anomalous children like SCP-734 have very delicate needs, a handler is always standing by in full hazmat gear to take care of the baby. These handlers are rotated every hour to maintain alertness and safety. These handlers feed and change SCP-734 regularly, and sometimes even provide toys that have been approved by the O5 Council. The Foundation has gone to great lengths to keep SCP-734 alive and comfortable, because they believe that SCP-734 could be an important asset for them in the future. Or more specifically, they see great strategic value in SCP-734's blood. As mentioned earlier, contact with any matter from SCP-734 triggers its deadly anomalous effects, including bodily fluids like blood. But unlike many toxic pathogens, in this case, there is no risk of the infection getting out of control, since the infected do not become vectors for transmission. Because of this, the blood of SCP-734 can act as a powerful weapon for both terminating anomalies deemed unviable by the O5 Council and assassinating dangerous people who belong to rival groups. Contact with the blood would completely destroy the target's body, with no other anomalous effects and no evidence of who exactly conducted the hit. SCP-734 has been fitted with an arterial catheter so that the Foundation can collect large quantities of blood from the anomalous infant every single week for storage and research. But it isn't just the blood that the Foundation sees potential in. SCP-734 himself has scored incredibly well on the Esslinger Loyalty Index, the test the Foundation uses to judge the loyalty of potential applicants to the Foundation cause. As SCP-734 matures, if these scores remain consistent, he will likely be trained to become a Foundation field agent in the future. An agent capable of killing someone with a touch would, needless to say, be an asset to certain covert missions that the Foundation would probably prefer to keep off the books. Of course, the SCP Foundation recruiting certain compliant anomalies to perform missions for them is far from unprecedented. The most infamous of these is SCP-076, also known as Abel, a supernatural, eternally resurrecting swordsman, and perhaps one of the finest warriors who ever lived. The Foundation took note of this and channeled his eternal thirst for battle into working with his very own mobile task force. He could assist in missions by taking out his bloodlust on enemy groups of interest and dangerous anomalies. However, this ended up working a little too well and led to disaster. Abel was so good at his job that he burned through all of his allotted missions at astonishing speed. Left with nothing more to do, Abel got antsy, which led him to turning his murderous desires on his fellow team members, and then the Foundation as a whole. It was an all-out massacre before his colleagues were finally able to kill him and return him to containment. The failure of this initiative gave the very idea of letting anomalies work for the Foundation in the field a bad name. But since then, things have changed, especially with the establishment of MTF Alpha 9, aka Last Hope, a new mobile task force formed entirely of anomalous individuals and their handlers. These consist of somewhat more stable anomalies, such as Abel's counterpart SCP-073, also known as Kane. Kane cannot be harmed, with any harm befalling him simply being mirrored back on his attacker. and his vast array of knowledge makes him an incredibly useful, intelligent asset. Another of the several members of Last Hope is Iris, also known as SCP-105. Much like Kane, Iris not only has anomalous powers that make her immensely valuable for missions in the field, she's also compliant and capable of listening to reason, unlike Kane. Her abilities include being able to actively surveil and even interact with photos of any location, especially when taken with her anomalous camera. Someday, SCP-734 could count himself among other anomalous Foundation agents like these, providing he continues to show promise and doesn't develop a dislike of the Foundation as he ages, since after all, he won't be a baby forever. So if you ever find yourself on the Foundation's bad side, you have a good reason to be paranoid. You'll have no idea that one day, the man who's going to kill you will approach and shake your hand with a smile. It won't be until later, when you feel that strange tingle on your palm and feel the skin starting to flake away, that you'll realize you've been a dead man walking for hours.
Have you ever seen something you weren't supposed to? Something that made you feel off? Something you regret? Secrets like these are best kept to yourself. But since you're still alive, whatever you saw wasn't nearly as bad as what Peter Holland saw one fateful night in January of 2015. Peter was an unremarkable man, an office worker, slaving away at the daily grind. And like a lot of people, Peter enjoyed nothing more than coming home after a long, hard day, kicking back and watching some TV. It was this innocent activity that led to Peter's horrifying brush with SCP-5049, altering the course of his otherwise average life forever. The event started at around 10:05 p.m. Peter was channel surfing, glued to the couch in his sparsely furnished apartment. Commercials, 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 as far as Peter's tired eyes could see. He paused for a moment to watch the end of an ad for a car he could never hope to afford on his salary. But something stopped him from changing the channel again. The next ad had begun, and it was playing a strange, scratchy jingle that gave Peter an odd sense of unease. But even stranger than that was the text on screen. Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot in baby blue bubble lettering. He forced a smile. This had to be some weird comedy skit or viral marketing campaign, or maybe it was something he drank. But no, this was a real commercial, and things were about to get even weirder. The peppy logo faded to a concerning sight. A tall humanoid figure dressed like a used car salesman, but one that definitely wasn't human. His skin was dark green and covered in patches of thick fur. He had long fingers with intimidating claws and a grin full of needle-like fangs. It looked almost demonic, and after a few seconds, the demon began to speak.
Hey there, folks, it's your man, Demon Dan, coming at you with the latest and greatest deals from Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. We've just accepted a shipment of brand new models that would make even the most discerning customers weep with excitement. Let's see what we've got.
The creature, apparently named Demon Dan, stepped away from his desk, revealing two long, furry goat legs that ended in large, pointed hooves. Peter now assumed he really was going crazy, but at this point he was along for the ride. Demon Dan continued his pitch.
Looking to make your way through the capitalist hellscape that makes home look cozy? Come try one of our newest businessman models.
Dan gestured behind him to where Peter was horrified to see a total of 52 adult male human bodies hanging from a wall. There was something uncanny about them. They seemed almost hollow, like a highly realistic costume or a prop from a horror movie. Peter didn't have much time to think about it though, as Demon Dan went on.
If you're looking for an extra challenge of inequality, the businesswoman model may be a right fit for you.
The commercial then revealed a wall of human female bodies strung up in a similar fashion.
Now, you may be thinking, but Dan, business sounds hard, I just want to have some fun. And the fine team here at Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot have got you covered.
The camera zoomed out to show an area of the store filled with children's decorations, and more of these strange, hollowed-out human suits in child sizes to match.
And who has more fun than kids? No one, that's who. For a limited time, the purchase of any child-size unit comes with a complimentary 50% off coupon for parental units. You just can't say no to a deal like that.
Before Peter could process the madness that was unfolding before him, the camera cut again.
the store's logo appeared on the screen once more, along with several cuts to locations around the store itself. There were more human bodies, hundreds of them. Demon Dan's sleazy voice rang out over all of it.
Here at Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, we know it's not all fun and games. The bravest among us have a mission to accomplish. The Seven Lords are ever planning their invasion after all, so you're looking for function over form. Well, we've got that in spades down here in the Tactical Services Department. You'll be kicking ass in no time when you're wearing the latest models at the best prices.
Seven Lords? Invasion? What did any of this mean? Suddenly the camera was showing him a new room. Red curtains parted, revealing more of these person suits, several bearing a striking resemblance to real human celebrities. He managed to make out Gucci Mane, Avril Lavigne, Paul McCartney, and Britney Spears before Demon Dan's appearance once again drew his attention.
I've got a special treat for you. We're happy to announce the VIP Lookalike Department. We all know how difficult the creation of Homunculus is. It's a fine art that takes years of practice. So when a replacement order on VIPs comes in, every detail needs to be perfect. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. But for the right price, you too can look like famous icons from around the globe.
The image of celebrity bodies faded from view, and Peter was left looking at the grinning Demon Dan standing behind the front desk of his impossible store once more. He said,
There you have it, folks. Come on down to Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. If you're viewing the advertisement, then you've been selected for entry. Please enter the nearest door for instant deals and upgrade those old duds for one of our newest models. What are you waiting for? Come on down.
The logo popped up again, hovering above some bold text that said, Please enter the nearest door. Peter had had enough. He switched off the TV. What a horror show, he thought. They should just warn you before they put short horror films on TV like that. He had no idea they could just slip them in among regular commercials. Surely Demon Dan and his store couldn't be real, right? But as his eyes drifted to the door in his room, he didn't feel quite so certain. Well, there was only one way to find out. Peter got up, went over to the door, took a deep breath, and walked through it. Peter Holland was never seen again. Not as himself, anyway. The SCP Foundation has long been aware of this sinister transmission, known as SCP-5049-2, and luckily has found ways to prevent it from claiming more victims. The Foundation Television Analysis Department, as well as webcrawler 40Y40, which is the software the Foundation uses to root out anomalous activity online, are always vigilant for signs of Demon Dan's commercial running. Just observing Demon Dan, who is himself classified as SCP-5049-A, and his ads put you in immediate danger, as they can transform any nearby doors into SCP-5049-1s. Those are interdimensional portals that remain active for around 15 minutes after viewing the ad. So then what specifically is SCP-5049? It's the entire pocket dimension known as Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, a Kettier-class spatial anomaly constantly on the lookout for new human victims, which it transforms into fleshy suits for its demonic clients, which let them blend in around humans. Prior to its discovery by the Foundation, it's likely that Demon Dan and his associates claimed hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. But sadly, even discovering this anomaly came at a gruesome cost to the Foundation. On February 16, 2020, the ad played on Safe Storage Warehouse 13's break room television. At the time of the broadcast, 4 Foundation personnel were present, including Security Agent William Birkin. Worrying that this was a potential security threat, Agent Birkin investigated the door to a nearby closet. The second he opened it, he was transformed to the storefront of Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. He saw Demon Dan himself standing at the corner, while 4 smaller reptilian imps fought over a small flesh suit. Demon Dan scolded them, before turning his attention to Agent Birkin.
Tis, you aren't supposed to be here, little man. How naughty. I'm gonna have to have a word with marketing once I'm through with you.
Agent Birkin, fearing for his safety, drew his weapon and shot Demon Dan 3 times. The creature dematerialized, before appearing right next to Agent Birkin and disarming him with a swift chop. The unfortunate security agent was then grabbed by the considerably larger Demon Dan and thrown over Dan's shoulder. We know all of this because Agent Birkin's standard issue Foundation body camera recorded the whole terrifying ordeal. even as Demon Dan dragged the helpless Birkin back into the twisted workshop behind the store. There, Birkin saw what would soon be his own fate right before his eyes. Dan's minions converting human bodies into fleshy suits for their demon clientele, and this unfortunate security officer was next. Dan gave him over to a pair of large sheep-like demons, and told them to drain, skin, and declaw him. Birkin's video feed finally cut as the demons pulled out their rusty tools and began to work on him. Of course, the SCP Foundation wouldn't take an attack on one of their operatives, inside one of their facilities no less, lying down. The unfortunate death of William Birkin allowed the Foundation to refine their methods of intercepting the broadcast of Demon Dan's commercials. They even had a new mobile task force, Mobile Strike Force Kappa 11, or the Baphomet Bashers, specifically to deal with Demon Dan and his cronies. They did more than just prevent him from taking new humans, though. When the Baphomet Bashers teamed up with an A-class clairvoyant entity to improve their efficiency in predicting future broadcasts, they were able to launch sting operations and arrest 21 different demonic customers for interrogation. This impressive strike back finally gave the Foundation some meaningful leverage over Demon Dan. And through the use of their clairvoyant entity, they were able to call a temporary truce and arrange a meeting with Demon Dan himself. Captain Steiner, an agent of the Foundation External Negotiation Department, was the one to interrogate Demon Dan. They sat across from each other at a table, and Demon Dan was clearly tense, frustrated with the way the Foundation had been messing with his business. All of their sting operations were frightening off his customers. In return for letting him continue his work, the Foundation wanted Dan to turn over all the information on his bosses and customers, allowing the Foundation to track their movements. When Dan was evasive about whether he'd comply, they tried threatening him. Dan laughed them off.
Go ahead, take your best shot, little man. There's a dozen more just like me. You won't stop anything.
Finally, he was pressured into giving a yes or no answer as to whether he'd willingly collaborate with the Foundation and act as an informant against his kind. When Demon Dan hinted that he may be willing to comply, he began to make a horrifying gurgling noise and gripped his head in pain. He began speaking in Latin in a voice that wasn't his own, as though the 7 demon lords he served were speaking through him. They said, "You are a fool, jailer, to think a pathetic morsel such as this could aid you against us. I have allowed you to toil in your own delusions for far too long. You may have taken advantage of Asmodeus all those years ago, but you stop nothing. You hinder nothing. You jail and barter to no avail. Your time is coming." And then Demon Dan's head exploded, which obviously prevented him from giving any incriminating information on those he worked for. Whoever the Demon Lords are, they're certainly the secretive type. You may think that this is the end of Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot and of SCP-5049, but soon another ad ran. It advertised the same products and services out of the same store. The only difference was that this time, a different entity was starring in it. It was July of 2004, and Bill Murray was enjoying the peak of an extremely successful career. Not only had the iconic actor starred in some of the most beloved comedies of the 20th century, including Ghostbusters and Groundhog Day, he'd voiced the main character of the recently released live-action Garfield movie. It'd been a financial success, but it was a critical flop. Not that this bothered Bill. He was happy with the performance and the paycheck. What he wouldn't be quite as happy about was the horrifying encounter he was about to have with SCP-3166. On July 8th, Bill was enjoying a cold drink on the porch of his luxurious Beverly Hills home. The sky was beginning to darken as the sun set in the west. It was a blissful evening. His wife Jennifer was inside, watching TV. Nothing seemed particularly out of the ordinary until he noticed a quick flash of orange in the distance. It was almost too fast to register, this large orange shape darting past the corner of his eye. For a second, he entertained the thought that it might have been an escaped tiger, but it was gone too fast to really tell. Bill finished his drink and headed inside. He had enough for one night. The next morning, he got up to read the paper and found the Garfield movie getting slaughtered by the critics. One review stated, "No one can accuse Garfield the movie of infidelity to its source. It faithfully conveys the banality of Jim Davis's cartoon." Another called it, "a film without energy and without spirit." He put the paper down and ate his breakfast. A few blows to the ego were worth it for the paydays that came with big-budget family films. Just then, his wife came to him with a strange question. "Were you walking around downstairs in the middle of the night?" No, he hadn't. He'd been sleeping like a baby. Why did she ask? "Well," Jennifer said, "I heard some rustling downstairs last night. It sounded like something big." He hadn't heard anything though, and told her it was probably just her imagination. He put it out of his mind and continued about his day. He decided he would keep his eyes peeled for that orange blur again though. Bill didn't see anything peculiar the rest of the morning and went to a local cafe for lunch. He ordered a coffee and a cream cheese bagel, then made a quick trip to the bathroom while his food was prepared. When Bill returned to his table though, there was something strange. Instead of a bagel, there was a large heaping of lasagna on the table. What was going on? This cafe didn't even serve lasagna. Bill knew something was terribly wrong. Things only got stranger when Bill came home to find a small tuft of orange fur snagged on the frame of his front door. And it wasn't synthetic fur like you'd see on plush toys or stuffed animals. No, this was real animal fur. Maybe someone was just goofing off or trying to play some weird prank on him. But it didn't feel like it. Deep down, Bill Murray knew that he was in grave danger. Whoever or whatever was behind this, it wanted to hurt him. That night, his worst fears were realized. Bill's wife had left town for the week, and he was headed to the kitchen in the middle of the night for a glass of water, when he saw something, a huge figure moving up against the glass door leading to his backyard. The thing was huge, nearly 7 feet tall, with a bloated, fur-covered, misshapen body that was pressed up against the door. Its fur was bright, garish orange, a cartoon orange. Strangest of all, though, was the sound it was making. It sounded like it was purring. Bill backed away from the door and then ran back to his room to hide. The whole night he sat cowering as he heard scratching against the walls, like something was trying to get in. He was terrified and too scared to do anything, even move. Finally, as morning broke, the noises seemed to stop. Bill had to do something. He couldn't let this nightmare go on another night. What if things got worse? What if that thing managed to get inside? He called the local police, and when they arrived, he explained the incredibly strange situation as best he could. He told them he was being stalked by some kind of huge cat, or at least someone dressed like a huge cat. Also, there was lasagna involved. The officers interviewing him could barely contain their laughter as he told them his story. A giant orange cat? Perhaps, one of them theorized, he angered some kind of obsessive Garfield fan through his involvement in the live-action movie. After all, the original comic had been running for years and had been extremely popular. Who knows what kind of nutjobs were obsessed with seeing only a faithful adaptation of the source material. As the officers departed, Bill was confident that they weren't taking him seriously. He couldn't rely on any of them for protection. Thankfully, from a multi-decade movie career, he had plenty of disposable income and decided to hire a private security team to protect him while he looked into this mystery. He had 2 trained bodyguards positioned around his home at all times for the next month. They were armed and given the cryptic orders to fire on anything orange. Meanwhile, Bill began to fall down a Garfield rabbit hole. He felt strangely compelled to research all the Garfield media he could find, as though the answer to his terrifying situation was somehow hidden between the lines. Bill explored the entire backlog of thousands of comic strips. He read the books and interviews with Jim Davis. He watched the cartoons and straight-to-DVD animated movies. Ironically, for a guy who'd recently portrayed the lasagna-loving orange cat, Bill had never felt quite so immersed in the character before. He found the strange pathos in the routine of Garfield and his friends. One particular comic really piqued his interest, though. Originally published in October of 1989, the comic began with Garfield being woken up by a strange chill, an almost eerie sensation. The character observed aloud that he didn't feel like he was in his own home. He explored his little home further, trying to find his owner John or his housemaid and sometimes nemesis Odie, but found nothing. As Garfield remarked on feeling alone, a purple speech box delivered the sinister message: You have no idea how alone you are, Garfield. He then finds that his home looks like it's been abandoned for years. The for sale sign outside is practically ancient. Garfield slowly comes to a horrifying revelation. Everyone really is gone, and his adventures and friends now exist only in his imagination. He's trapped in a prison of his own creation, trying to stave off his endless loneliness, in denial about the reality of his situation. The comic ended with a quote directly from Jim Davis himself saying, "An imagination is a powerful tool. It can tint memories of the past, shade perceptions of the present, or paint a future so vivid that it can entice or terrify, all depending upon how we conduct ourselves today." As he read those words, Bill Murray felt a chill down his spine. Why had he wanted to get involved in the Garfield movie in the first place? What had he gotten himself into? Before he could slip any deeper into his own mind, Bill heard a faint, choked scream downstairs. He felt his breath catch in his throat. He was terrified, but needed to see what was happening. He carefully and quietly began to creep down the stairs. At the bottom, he poked his head around a corner, and that's when he saw a member of his security detail lying dead on the floor. His face was blue from asphyxiation. His mouth was stuffed with lasagna. It looked like he had been force-fed to death. Bill wanted to scream, but he couldn't, or maybe knew he shouldn't. Just then he heard a soft, meaty thumping noise coming from the nearby living room. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to approach, as if by forces beyond his control. He made his way to the living room, and when he'd got there, he saw where the noise was coming from. Bill's jaw dropped in pure horror. There was the other member of his security detail, lying limp and lifeless under a giant orange figure. It was a grotesquely huge creature, wearing what looked to be a kind of crude Garfield outfit made of sewn-together cat pelts. It stank of pasta and rotten meat. In its giant paw, it held a golden trophy, which it was using to pound the security guard's head into mush, while making quiet, cat-like purring noises. The creature suddenly stopped and looked up, locking eyes with Bill. The fear of death came over him. He froze as the giant, freakish Garfield stepped over Donnie's corpse and began to come towards him. Bill turned and ran, but Garfield was gaining on him. Before he could make it to the front door, the creature knocked him over. He was laid out on the ground, looking up at it as it reached into its own body cavity and began to pull out handfuls of lasagna. He was about to shove a wad of the horrible, decaying pasta into Bill's mouth when suddenly a ding was heard, and the creature stopped. It looked up, as if sniffing the air, and then suddenly turned and lumbered towards the kitchen. Bill watched as the Garfield monster entered the kitchen, where somehow there was a steaming hot fresh lasagna sitting in the open oven. The creature had sensed the presence of external lasagna and felt the compulsion to integrate it into its body, grabbing fistfuls and shoving it into itself. Just then, a group of highly trained SCP Foundation personnel burst into the room and subdued the creature. It had been an ambush. The Foundation had been tipped off to the presence of the creature by monitoring the local police department dispatches, and the report of a 7-foot-tall comic book cat terrorizing a Hollywood actor was definitely worth looking into. The monster that had almost taken Bill Murray's life was SCP-3166, a deadly pataphysical being that tends to manifest around people somehow involved in the Garfield intellectual property. It appears whenever the public perception of Garfield falls out of favor, and because Bill had starred in the critically panned Garfield movie, he was currently at the very top of SCP-3166's hit list. Thankfully, he managed to survive his terrifying ordeal, and was administered amnestics by Foundation personnel so that he could return to his normal life. This frightening and mysterious creature has been around since 1989, appearing after the publication of the haunting Garfield comic that Bill had read that very night. It appeared in the office of United Media, who were the publishers of the Garfield comic strip at the time, and began wreaking havoc. Since then, the creature's manifestation has been a constant threat whenever Garfield loses its popularity or audience. As a result, the Foundation has spent years as the funding source behind all Garfield media, and even planting hypnotic mimetics into the comic strips to ensure that there is always a loyal fan base. The fur is indeed real organic cat fur, albeit an unnaturally orange color. and instead of organs, the creature is filled with lasagna. Worst of all, though, is that testing has revealed that the meat in the lasagna is genetically identical to the flesh of Garfield's creator, Jim Davis. How did this thing come into existence? Perhaps it was Jim's sheer force of imagination that dragged it into being. As he himself said, an imagination is a powerful tool. All in all, it's lucky that Bill Murray was able to survive his encounter and return to his normal life. Well, as normal as life can be for Bill Murray. And if you see Bill Murray, don't bother asking him about SCP-3166. The amnestics were quite effective, and just as he's fond of saying himself, no one will ever believe you. Jay and Michael were a pair of urban exploration YouTubers looking for their big break. You might remember their video exploring the dead mall on the outskirts of your town, or the supposedly haunted 1950s insane asylum out in the sticks. But you certainly won't find these videos anywhere online. After the incident at SCP-823, all of their content was scrubbed away from even the most comprehensive internet archives. Why, you ask? Because these unfortunate urban explorers decided that their big break would be exploring a certain abandoned theme park, and it would be one of the last decisions they ever made. Michael and Jay had heard rumors about the theme park. Its name was lost to time, as was the date of its opening and closing, and the reason it was even abandoned in the first place. Even some of the most hardcore urban explorers didn't dare to tread there. Something about it, a good friend had once told Jay, just didn't feel right. Sometimes if you dare to venture into the forest near the theme park at night, you can still hear music. The jolly, piping tunes of rides and carnival stands still beckoning, as if to say, we're still here, come and play. Of course, none of this frightened Jay and Michael. They could already smell the sponsorships from headlamp and compact camera companies. No amount of anxiety would stop them from making their doomed trip to the so-called Carnival of Horrors. It's a terrible shame. If they'd listened to the stories of this place about how unnatural and evil it could be, they might still be alive today. Like all the best urban explorers, they arrived at the woods near the abandoned theme park in the dead of night. They ignored the signs warning them about everything from structural instability to dangerous wild animals to asbestos. Nothing would keep them out. Nothing. They reached the abandoned theme park not long after, though it was a mere shell of its former self. During the several decades of abandonment, nature had reclaimed it. The Ferris wheel was covered in overgrown ivy, and the carnival stands were blanketed with mold. As the duo swept through the grounds with their flashlights and cameras, they saw a faded sign that bore the words, Thriller Chiller, the park's most popular roller coaster. They also took their time to marvel at the exceptionally creepy-looking Tunnel of Love, the broken-down House of Mirrors, and a huge grinning statue of the park's former mascot, Happy Hippo. This theme park was something out of a nightmare, which naturally made it potential video gold. But as the excited duo wandered further into the park, they couldn't help but notice the quiet, tinny carnival music. Music that seemed to be drawing them closer. Michael asked Jay if he could hear the strange, impossible music, and felt a chill creep in when he answered that he did. Could all of the stories be true? They were lost in thought, but their legs kept moving. They were getting closer to something now. They could feel a presence. And was that music getting louder? An instant later, though, another sound cut through the silence. Bang, bang. It echoed out through the still night air. Birds flew from their perches in the trees. Jay and Michael both fell to the ground dead, their heads taken off by the 50 caliber rounds of a highly trained mobile task force sniper on the payroll of the SCP Foundation. Their recording equipment, along with their bodies, were taken and destroyed. Any trace of them were scrubbed from the internet. It may seem a little harsh, but a bullet to the head is much kinder fate than what would have awaited these two if they'd kept walking. That's because the Carnival of Horrors is no dark fairy tale. The rumors are all true, and something really is waiting in the dark. That's why this abandoned theme park is known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-823, a Euclid-class anomaly with a violent history. What's even more unnerving is that the researchers studying 823 have repeatedly implored the O5 Council to increase the park's classification to Ketier and allocate more resources for containment, only to be denied. But after you've heard about the horrors that unfolded there, and the danger it poses, you'll probably take the researchers' side. The park is divided into 2 zones, the yellow zone and the red zone. There are to be at least 6 members of Foundation personnel present in the yellow zone at all times to ensure that no civilians wander in. Our 2 urban explorers earn themselves a death sentence not just by wandering into the yellow zone, but passing dangerously close to the red zone. This is the true epicenter of the park's dangerous, anomalous activity. It's a place so hazardous that anyone entering, whether they're a civilian or a member of Foundation staff, is to be executed at a distance by sniper fire without hesitation. Once upon a time, though nobody knows exactly when, there was a theme park that seemed no different to any other. Eager children and thrill-seeking teens arrived by the busload, ready to stuff their faces with cotton candy and corn dogs, and then reverse the process on a vast array of roller coasters. But even then, during these good times, there was something dark lurking behind the cheerful facade. Little by little, everyone, visitors and employees alike, started falling victim to strange and horrific accidents around the park. Of course, when it comes to theme parks, accidents come with the territory, but none like this. Here are just a handful of the horrific and mysterious deaths that occurred while the park was open. So strap in, because just like a roller coaster, this isn't for the faint of heart. A pair of young lovebirds decided they wanted to enjoy the romance of the Tunnel of Love. The 2 sat in a swan-shaped boat as they were ferried through darkened passageways. Anyone would assume that they were having a great time, but at some point, terrible shrieks of pain and fear began to echo through the ride. Attendants, confused and terrified, stopped the ride and found that the screaming persisted. Just some stupid teens playing a prank, they figured, and started the ride again. But when the swan-shaped boat finally exited the Tunnel of Love, the park employees were greeted to a horrifying sight. The 2 teens dead, their bodies somehow fused together at multiple points. Another unlucky customer met a gruesome fate inside the House of Mirrors. They entered, but while inside, they were stalked by a mysterious, carnivorous humanoid entity known as Subject 79. The customer was pursued and eventually caught by Subject 79 and brutally dismembered. Some parts of the body were fused to the House of Mirrors interior, while others, like the right arm, were never found. The customer actually survived their ordeal, and whether that's a happy ending is up to you. But it wasn't just the customers at the park who were in danger. A 23-year-old park employee working a summer job collapsed while entertaining children dressed as the park's cheerful mascot, Happy Hippo. It wasn't uncommon for people to get overheated and collapse in the heavy suits on hot days. But one thing was different here. He was screaming, crying, and trying desperately to remove his mask. People rushed to help, but nobody could get the suit off, and he was declared dead soon after. When he was eventually cut out of the suit, coroners found that the employee had choked to death. His mouth, trachea, and lungs were filled with a fibrous substance later determined to be identical to the stuffing of his costume. An intense roller coaster known as the Thriller Chiller was a magnet for horrific accidents, which became more violent and intense over time. The first accident seemed like a typical theme park tragedy. A safety harness failed, dropping a rider 15 feet during an inverted loop. They landed on the track below, breaking their neck and skull, causing instant death. While this was a tragedy, it wasn't exactly anomalous, but the next major accident on the ride was an entirely different story. This time, 15 people met with disaster while riding the Thriller Chiller roller coaster. Starting from the front and moving back 1 car at a time, each group of riders was decapitated by blunt force trauma. A new pair of decapitations appeared to happen at every turn and loop on the ride. Forensic scientists still have no idea how this could have possibly occurred. Despite all of these disasters, the park was only finally abandoned after a day known as Bloody Sunday, when the anomalous powers of the location reached a 20-year peak. It's believed that 231 people were killed during the carnage of that day, and another 7 were horribly maimed. The SCP Foundation contained the Carnival of Horrors not long after, but the mysterious deaths didn't even end there. Foundation Mobile Task Force Row 71, also known as the Origami Toads, were sent in to assess containment procedures and discover the source of all the anomalous deaths. They were unsuccessful though, and instead they merely added to the list in exceptionally horrifying ways. One agent was found dead, surrounded by empty grenades and bullet casings. It appeared he'd removed the explosive propellant from all of his ballistics and consumed it, dying in the process. Another was found with his jaw broken, having apparently pulled out and inhaled his own teeth, and dying of the resulting internal damage. The commander got the worst fate of all, so horrifying in fact, that we can't tell you the full details. All you need to know is that something was shoved into his brain that really didn't belong there. The Foundation considered having the entire park destroyed with a massive airstrike, courtesy of the Mobile Task Force New 7, aka Hammerdown. However, the O5 Council denied this request, on the basis that the park was too close to populated land. They'd have no plausible cover story for the bombing, and they don't even really know if blowing up the park would prevent anomalous activity from occurring. The Carnival of Horrors is here to stay, folks. The Foundation just hopes to keep it from getting new visitors. So then back to why the researchers want this place upgraded to Ketir. After all, these classifications aren't about how dangerous an anomaly is. They're about how difficult and complicated they are to contain. But here's the problem. According to the researchers, the red zone, where the dangerous anomalous activity is at its peak, isn't bound to one fixed position. It's changed position at least 3 times already, and even worse, it appears to be growing. Not seemingly so Euclid class now, is it? After all, you might not even need to visit the Carnival of Horrors to be in grave danger. If it keeps growing, then someday soon, the Carnival of Horrors may be visiting you. Stop me if you've heard this one before. A young man was driving home from work late one rainy night when he spotted a woman in a white dress and a red sweater walking along the shoulder of the road. Concerned for her safety, he slowed down and rolled down the window so he could talk to her. When he asked where she was going, she said she was walking to her parents' house. The man pulled over and offered her a ride that she accepted. The woman gave him the address of her home, hopped in the back seat, and the man drove off. He sensed that she must have been cold from walking in the rain, so he cranked up the car's heater to help her dry off. Soon she removed her heavy red sweater and placed it on the seat next to her. The man tried to make friendly conversation, asking if the woman had a job, what she was studying at school, where'd she been that day, but she remained quiet, staring out the window. Until they drove past an old graveyard. The woman began pounding on the glass of the car as if she desperately wanted something. Unsure of what to do, the man pulled over, but before he could ask her what was happening, she had gotten out of the car. He exited the car to try and find her, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. She must have somehow ran off. Confused, the man got back in his car and drove away. He went on his way and didn't think of it again until the next day, when he noticed her sweater was still in the back of his car. He decided to go to the house she had originally given him the address for and give it back to her. He found the home without any trouble, but when he knocked on the door, the old woman who answered it was confused by his story. She told him that her daughter couldn't have possibly left her sweater in his car because she died in a car accident 30 years ago. The Vanishing Hitchhiker is a classic ghost story, with the details varying from place to place and storyteller to storyteller. In Chicago, she goes by Resurrection Mary, named after the graveyard she asks for rides to. In Okinawa, Japan, she's known as the Nightwalker of Nago, and she only appears to taxi drivers. In Kent, England, she's Suzanne, a bride killed in a car wreck on the way to her bachelorette party. In North Carolina, her name is Lydia, and in Hawaii, she's believed to be the goddess Pele in human form. But as far as our friends at the SCP Foundation are concerned, the Vanishing Hitchhiker's name is Mary Talish, also known as SCP-3037. On the 19th of May, 1952, college sophomore Mary Talish was abducted on her way to class in her hometown of Muncie, Indiana. When police found her body 2 weeks later, her eyes and heart had been torn from her body in a ritualistic fashion, and she had scrapes and bruises that suggested she had been beaten before her murder. Her killers were never caught, and her body was returned to her family for burial in Tomlinson Cemetery. Starting on the 19th of June that same year, someone matching Mary's description, a Caucasian woman with blonde hair standing 150 centimeters tall and wearing a red sweater, was spotted trying to flag down passing vehicles along Mayflower Road. Since then, every month on the 19th, Mary has been sighted along that stretch of road. and every month the same scenario plays out. Mary gives anyone who picks her up directions to her parents' house. Then on the way, she instructs the driver to stop at the graveyard where she was buried. She vanishes from the car, leaving her sweater. The driver of the car tries to return the sweater to her parents' house, only to be told that Mary Tallish was dead. When the SCP Foundation was made aware of Mary Tallish's pattern of haunting in the late 50s, they set up a system where agents would patrol Mayflower Road at hourly intervals with the intention of picking Mary up. Agents were sent on their own, in non-Foundation cars, and instructed to stick to the accepted script of the vanishing hitchhiker legend, without attempting to engage Mary in further conversation. Mary's parents were also given E-Class agent status to keep them from speaking about the haunting, and told that the Foundation was working on a way to set the spirit to rest. Early attempts to study the apparition were inconclusive. It proved impossible for the Foundation to relocate her or trigger her manifestation outside of the 19th of every month, and attempts to analyze her sweater were fruitless, since if the sweater wasn't returned to the Tallish family home, it would simply vanish from containment at or around sunset on the next 19th. For 20 years, SCP-1337 events continued to happen as normal. D-Class personnel under the instruction of the Foundation would pick Mary up, drive her past the cemetery, and return her sweater to her parents. It was business as usual, and in fact it was one of the more sedate reoccurring apparitions the Foundation had to deal with. But, as you might have guessed, that peace wouldn't last forever. Enter Dr. Lawson, who in 1972 was placed in charge of all resources regarding SCP-1337. Dr. Lawson was getting sick of all this phantom hitchhiker business, and while most of the Foundation was happy to keep this routine going, Lawson thought that the continual picking up and dropping off of Mary Tallish and her red sweater was a waste of the Foundation's valuable time. After all, it was the early 70s. The price of oil was at an all-time high, so the expense of sending car after car up and down the same road for a solid day once a month just to pick up a ghost was more trouble than it was worth. So Lawson started developing a plan, one that he didn't go through the proper Foundation channels to approve. He reasoned that the reason Mary's ghost kept coming back was because she wanted something. Since always asked for a ride home, then it must mean she wanted to return back to her parents. So logic followed that if she had nothing or no one to go back to, then she'd stop appearing. On the 18th of June 1973, Lawson went ahead with his plan without his superior's knowledge and ordered the execution of Mary Tallish's parents, as well as the immediate demolition of their family home. According to his journals, Lawson had hoped that his attempt at decommissioning 1337 would significantly cut the Foundation's gas bills, freeing up valuable funds, at which point he'd surely be promoted in recognition of his brilliance. But that wasn't what happened. Lawson was demoted from team leader to junior staff, and only kept on 1337 detail out of the belief that, without a family to return to, Lawson would become the new focal point of the haunting should Mary Tallish ever return. Though Lawson's actions weren't at all above board, even by SCP Foundation standards, they did seem to have worked. The 19th of June came and went without a single Mary sighting, and she wasn't seen the next month either. A full year went by without any sign of the Mayflower Road apparition. Satisfied with this turn of events, the Foundation made the decision to officially reclassify SCP-1337 from safe to safe decommissioned, and the gas money that was budgeted for the Mayflower Road Patrol was redirected to the SCP-682 Tank Acid Fund. But even though everything seemed to have been sorted out, Lawson wasn't entirely satisfied, and not just because of his demotion. Whether it was intuition or merely guilt-induced paranoia is unclear, but he suspected that Mary was still out there somewhere. At first he thought that she might show up on the anniversary of her parents' deaths, but then that date came and went, as did 8 more anniversaries after it. Finally, on the 19th of June 1983, Lawson decided he had to see for himself. Fitted with recording equipment, he drove alone, in a non-Foundation standard car, down that lonely stretch of road, where so many before him had stopped to pick up that mysterious blonde woman with the red sweater. He had to prove to himself that she wouldn't show up, that he had really and truly gotten rid of her for good. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening when he reached Mayflower Road. At first, he didn't experience anything strange. He scanned the roadside, looking for the phantom hitchhiker walking along it. but there was nobody there. Dr. Lawson breathed a sigh of relief. He may have orchestrated the deaths of 2 innocent people, but at least it hadn't been for nothing. He turned on the recorder he brought with him and logged that nothing had happened. SCP-3037 had been permanently neutralized. As he approached the T intersection and prepared to turn onto Marsh Avenue, he looked up to adjust his rearview mirror. To his horror, he found that he wasn't alone in the car. Someone was in the seat behind him. Someone with blonde hair and a red sweater. His last transmission consisted only of,
"Wait, who the hell are you?"
before the recording abruptly stopped. Lawson's car was found soon after by Foundation agents. Lawson was dead in the front seat, bruised and bloody, with his eyes and heart ripped out in a ritualistic fashion, just the way Mary Talish had been found all the way back in 1952. It turns out that Mary hadn't been neutralized after all. She'd just been waiting for a chance to get revenge on the man who killed her family. And Mary didn't stop with Dr. Lawson. No longer does she appear, walking along the road waiting for someone to offer her a ride before disappearing without incident. Now, should someone pass by without offering a ride, she will appear in their back seat before reenacting the method of her own death upon the driver. And her physical appearance has changed too. Whereas before she looked like the image of a pretty young woman before her tragedy, now recordings show that she appears with the wounds of her death present, her eyes gouged out in their sockets, and a massive hole in her chest where her heart should be. The same wounds she inflicts on her victims. The SCP Foundation has tried closing off and eventually destroying the road, but that has only resulted in Mary manifesting at other locations in and around Muncie. Foundation documents reveal that any back road in the city can potentially serve as host to a 1337 event, and all attempts to contain the apparition have failed. The only way someone who has seen Mary can avoid her wrath is by stopping to pick her up, at which point she will dematerialize before reappearing on another road. Mobile task forces have been unsuccessful, as Mary only appears to those driving alone, and all agents who have been sent on solo missions to apprehend her have resulted in the death of the agent. SCP-1337 was reinstated, this time as Euclid class. Currently, the Foundation's method of managing SCP-1337 is to dispatch a security team on the 19th of every month to monitor all the places where a potential sighting could take place. As soon as signs of a manifestation are identified, a remotely controlled vehicle containing a single D-Class is driven to the location. Once Mary appears in the car is piloted to the empty lot where her home used to stand, and the remains of the D-Class are then disposed of. Like a lot of the stories that get passed down as urban legends, the story of SCP-1337 has a lesson that can be taken away from it. This SCP started off as an ordinary local haunting, no more deadly than Lydia, Suzanne, Resurrection Mary, or any of the countless other local versions of the Vanishing Hitchhiker story. But thanks to one rogue Foundation doctor and his desire to rush what he thought would be an efficient solution, the spirit not only became harder to control, but also much more violent and bloodthirsty than anyone was prepared to deal with. So if there's anything we can learn here, it's that no matter if you're a student, an office worker, or a researcher with the SCP Foundation, think twice about cutting corners. It might save you a little bit of time and money in the short term, but in the long term, the results could be fatal. In a remote part of Russia, a mysterious disease outbreak was tearing through a tiny farming village with terrifying side effects. There was no cure, no clue to where it came from, and worst of all, the disease's terrifying impact didn't end with death. No, it was after those carrying the disease died that the real horrors started. After an agonizing fever that leaves the victims writhing in pain, they quickly succumb to the disease, only to rise from their graves to wreak havoc on the living. The virus continues to spread until the corpses outnumber those trying to hide from them, as the world spirals into almost certain ruin. It sounds like the plot of a zombie movie, but for the SCP Foundation, this is anything but fiction. And the terror that unfolded in that little Siberian town is the first recorded encounter with SCP-610, also known as the Flesh That Hates. First, livestock began to vanish from farms. Theft or wild animals were suspected, but no suspects could be found, and no mutilated remains turned up. The animals weren't being stolen, and they weren't being eaten, so What happened to them? With no more animals left to lose, the farmers themselves then began to disappear. But the authorities refused to take the missing persons cases seriously. The missing farmers' families would contact the police, make a report, and then the whole thing was forgotten. It was written off just as another unsolved disappearance, which wasn't uncommon in the wild and unforgiving region. Then, the police themselves began to disappear. The families of the missing farmers would sometimes report strange sounds from the surrounding woods, describing moans and inhuman screeches of pain. One young boy reported seeing a cow with what he described as tentacles lurking around the edge of the trees. Regional police were dispatched to the location and ordered to investigate and report back on their findings within 24 hours. But the units sent to the area didn't report back and were never heard from again. Upon learning of the reports, the Russian government grew increasingly concerned, fearing domestic insurgency or foreign espionage of some kind could be at play. They sent a small team of special agents to the area, and one by one, those agents disappeared, just like the others before them. It seemed no one who went into the village after the disappearances started ever came out again. They had all simply vanished. Desperate for answers, the Russian government contacted the only people in the world who could help: the SCP Foundation. What the Foundation found over the course of their investigation would shock and unnerve them, going beyond anything they had previously discovered. Before the investigation officially began, the affected area was sealed off by the Russian government. Not knowing if it would be safe to send researchers into the containment perimeter, the Foundation set up a small camera-mounted unit, nicknamed Herbie, to capture footage of whatever remained of the village. The images captured by Herbie revealed what exactly had become of the people in this doomed village, and the true nightmarish nature of SCP-610. SCP-610 is a Keter-class entity, meaning it's an anomaly that's exceedingly difficult to contain consistently or reliably, with containment procedures often being extensive and complex. 610 is a highly contagious skin disease that initially manifests like an ordinary allergic reaction, with symptoms including increased sensitivity, itching, and a rash. But within just 3 hours of those initial symptoms appearing, the rash starts to turn into masses of scar tissue on the chest and arms. These masses spread over the legs and back of the victim and completely consume them in thick, rubbery flesh within 5 hours. Once they're covered, the victim will cease all vital functions. Unfortunately for them, and doubly so for those around them, they do not stay dead. About 3 minutes after expiring, the victim's vitals will restart at a heightened rate, and the masses of flesh encasing their body will begin to move and multiply, mutating them into a form beyond anything resembling the human they once were. The specific type of mutation varies from case to case, but has included the head becoming massive and bulbous, the growth of extra limbs, and, in especially gruesome cases, the victim's body splitting apart to allow extra tendrils of flesh to sprout from the open wound. Occasionally, an infected person will stop moving and become rooted to the ground in a set location. Once it is settled, their flesh will spread itself across the ground, encasing all nearby objects in flaps of scar tissue. The infected that maintain their mobility are highly aggressive, even violent, and will attempt to infect any living thing that comes into their line of sight. The disease does not only infect humans, and can take over any living organism within a matter of hours. Due to the highly contagious and dangerous nature of the disease, safe observation of infected specimens and areas is only possible with drones and mounted cameras. This brings us back to Herbie, the first such mounted camera to record footage of the infected area. Herbie was deployed to an infection site, also known as Site A, without any damage. It remained at the outside perimeter of the village for 2 hours, observing several infected humans and fire damage to many of the homes, before following an infected into an intact house. Herbie's camera feed captured the infected person entering the house and sitting down at the table inside. There were several other infected humans in the house, and one unidentified infected creature that remained immobile under the table. After viciously assaulting one of the other infected humans, the infected returned to the table and began to lay out plates on top of it. Pieces of its flesh began to wriggle and tear away from its body, before settling onto each plate. Once the plates were filled, the infected sitting at the table began to grab at the flesh and crush it into their mouths, in a perverse imitation of a normal mealtime gathering. After capturing this stomach-churning display, Herbie left the house and continued to explore the village. It recorded footage of a large stack of bodies that seemed to be made up of both Russian military and civilians, with an infected sitting on top. As Herbie maneuvered towards the remains of the town hall, an infected grabbed the rover off the ground. Herbie's camera was able to capture the face of the infected that grabbed the rover. The face was that of a young girl around 10 years old, strangely intact atop a large, distorted body. The final moments of Herbie's camera feed captured the infected girl's face bursting open, revealing tendrils of flesh that pulled Herbie into the gaping maw. Then, the feed cut to black. Herbie was regarded as lost, but the video feed briefly resumed 5 hours later, showing the camera covered with an unidentified slime. After this, the video feed was cut for good, and Herbie abandoned in Site A. The Foundation has sent several manned expeditions into Site A, where many expedition forces have fallen victim to the infected. Several operatives were also lost in an earthquake that revealed a network of underground tunnels. A manned expedition into these tunnels was attempted, and the video feed that was captured by the researchers on the expedition was deeply disturbing. There were images of an abandoned church filled with infected, and a mass of uninfected or partially infected human captives. The final moments of the video feed from this expedition captured several operatives being murdered by an infected human wielding a farming scythe, indicating that the infected are capable of using simple weaponry in addition to brute force. The use of this weapon, paired with the presence of captives in the underground tunnels, paints a terrifying picture of the kind of organization the infected are capable of. No more manned expeditions have been attempted, or if they have been highly classified. Ordinarily, once a new SCP is discovered, it is placed in containment at the Foundation, with special procedures in place so that it can be studied or even neutralized in the rare occasions where it's deemed necessary. When it comes to SCP-610 though, containment might just be impossible. It simply covers too much area and is too dangerous to expose to human researchers. Instead, all infected areas have been isolated with the permission of the Russian government. There is an official perimeter established around these areas, and any civilians that approach them are told to leave under the pretense of ongoing military operations. For once, a top-secret military project is the more innocent answer. Armed guards are placed at the perimeter of every infected area, and any living thing with symptoms of SCP-610 spotted near the perimeter is to be immobilized, killed, and burned from as far away as possible. Any living thing that comes in contact with SCP-610, whether a soldier, a scientist, or a civilian, is immediately terminated and their remains destroyed. If someone comes within 3 meters of an infected organism, they will be quarantined and remotely examined to determine if they have been infected. While the spread of SCP-610 can be airborne, it has been determined to be far less contagious when spread through air particles as opposed to physical contact. The infection sites remain active to this day, like modern-day leper colonies, though they are isolated from the general population, and the military is doing everything in their power to contain the infected. SCP-610 is still very much alive. It is rare for an entity to exist that the Foundation cannot truly contain, but can only try to guard against, and that makes this infection all the more terrifying. Who knows how much it has mutated over the years, growing, spreading, hungry for new hosts. There is still so much that the Foundation does not know about the flesh that hates, such as how it works, what it can do, or even where it came from, since the origin of the first infection is still, at this point, entirely unknown. It has shown itself to be capable of learning, planning, and protecting itself, so who is to say that it couldn't figure out a way to escape from its isolated area? It is so highly contagious and spreads so quickly that just one tiny infected rabbit and one inattentive soldier could be enough for SCP-610 to reach the general population. If it did, its violent, destructive nature and hatred for all life would mean that everything, not just the people, but animals, plants, and the world itself, could be at risk. And no one is ready for this kind of infection, a disease that turns the human body against itself, turns our skin into a weapon and a tomb, stripping away identity, humanity, and everything that isn't made of the same hateful flesh. So let's hope that the perimeter holds. And the next time you feel a little itchy, try not to think about what might happen next. Now go check out SCP-939 with many voices and SCP-096 the Shy Guy for more anomalies that'll keep you up at night.